Welcome, everybody. Oh, let me adjust my camera shot a little bit. That's the bad thing about being someone who's worked in television production and still does is that I'm very nitpicky about headroom. But then again, look who I'm talking to. So I think I'm safe.
I just put my face in the center of the camera and then go. I will not be winning any Oscars for best cinematography.
Hello, welcome everybody. I'm your host, John Webster. With me, as always, is my good friend Jared Kozel, and welcome to Cinematic Realms. I think we'll have some people joining us as we go along because it sounds like we have a couple of people seeing the movie tonight that we're talking about. And this is part of the hazard of doing a new release, which we usually don't do, but this little film called Dune Part 2, it seems like a few people are going to see it.
Just a few.
Which I have to admit, and I felt this way about part one. It's very vindicating for me because we are both big fans of this film, Blade Runner 2049. And that was a movie that did not do well at the box office, kind of mirrored the original Blade Runner a little too closely. um in public reception, although it got absolutely phenomenal reviews. So that's always going to be like a little sore point for me, as I'm like, y'all didn't jump on board a little faster and go see that Denis masterpiece. But that's okay because I'm really thrilled with the way that his Dune adaptation has been received, and especially this one, which we are going to talk about for the next couple hours. That I don't know what else to say, but wow. It's rare. It feels rare to get to experience something like this. Although we were blessed this year with, I think one of the last year, that is, with, I think, one of the best films in many years, which was Oppenheimer, which you and I are going to be rooting for at the Oscars tomorrow night. We might talk a bit more about that later too. But to see a genre movie that really is just that's transcendent, and we'll talk about comparisons to another film series of my youth that I drew the connection to Lord of the Rings, and I feel like I gave the wrong impression with that because, of course, nothing will ever touch Lord of the Rings for me. I think, as people well know, but this felt similar in terms of its the level of achievement and what I think it means for its genre. And that's not a frequent occurrence. It's rare that you get to sit in the theater and sort of have chills up the back of your spine as you're watching something and realize, take this in because this is big. And all the more so because I've only gotten to see it once so far. I saw it on Monday, but it might as well have been an eternity for how long it feels, and I'm looking forward to getting to go see it again next week. But yeah, so that's how I'm feeling right now. Why don't you take over for a couple minutes, Jared? How are you feeling in the aftermath of getting to see this film?
I am just extraordinarily impressed, and as you said, feeling very satisfied and happy for everyone involved with this movie because it is such an artistic triumph. But especially for the director, Denis Villeneuve, because we have talked on this channel. We have made no secret about the fact that we love genre movies, specifically science fiction and fantasy type movies. And we also love filmmakers that can tell big, creatively driven, like auteur type stories on the big screen with a level of artistry and thematic resonance that we sometimes feel that is a rare thing, which, and it should be rare because this kind of artistry is, not the kind of thing that comes along every day. That's one of the reasons that it deserves to be celebrated.
Yes.
Also, specifically for Denis Villeneuve as a filmmaker, when you look at he's only made about like 11 movies or so, 11 theatrical movies, and if you, unlike another director who we've talked about a lot on this channel, who we love dearly, who also specializes in these types of movies, Christopher Nolan. Christopher Nolan kind of exploded out of the gate after his initial debut feature following. He wrote and directed Memento, which got him an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. Whereas Denis Villeneuve, and then Nolan obviously continued to build his art, cinematic repertoire through. And I'm of the opinion, I think all 12 of his movies have been great, culminating in his magnum opus with Oppenheimer this past year. But Denis Villeneuve started off, he's on a smaller scale, let's say. His first movie was a movie called August 32nd on Earth, then Maelstrom, then Polytechnique, which are movies that I admit, even as much as I love Denis Villeneuve, I really had not taken the time to seek out. And because it's, they're the kind of films that a filmmaker who is trying to make his mark is, when he's starting out, it would make those type of films. You wouldn't expect him to get recognition right away. Then he did also manage to break in with the Oscar recognition with his 2010 film Incendie, which I love that movie. That was a movie that it got nominated for the best foreign language film at the time Oscar, and it's a very different type of movie than some of the movies that would come to populate his later filmography, but it's a true artist's vision, that movie. With a very shocking and upsetting twist in it that it is part of what elevates the movie. But after that, that's kind of a marker in his career because that gave him the creative latitude to start making movies that were more ambitious in scale. After that, he did Prisoners, which a lot of people love. It's a kind of very dark psychological thriller type movie. Then he did Enemy, and then Sicario in 2015. Which is another very dark and intense movie that I think is very well done. But then where he really has hit another level, at least in my regard for him, is what he's done with the genre of science fiction. Because starting in 2016, he made Arrival. And that movie got him a nomination for Best Picture. It got him the nomination for Best Director, his only one to date. But that was a movie that, looking at the premise of it, you were just like, this shouldn't work as a movie. But not only does it work, it's spectacular. Helped by a phenomenal performance by Amy Adams that was robbed of Academy recognition. But it's been a deeply emotional and intellectually stirring movie, Arrival.
Yeah, if we get the chance to do a stream on Arrival on this channel, I will get to talk about how I went into that movie almost entirely blind, because I think I had vaguely seen TV spots on on television. Imagine that, and so beyond the concept.
Yep.
I didn't know what the movie was going to bring, and I just remember sitting in that theater as they're going up into the ship.
Yeah.
And there's just this suspense about what what's coming at them. And I just remember sitting in the theater being like, I have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I was just like, you use the phrase on the edge of your seat so much that it's meaningless. But I literally was like grabbing onto the the ends of my seat, leaning forward and being like, what's going to happen? And so like, I think I had not seen a lot of Denis' earlier filmography. It's something I have to correct, but I was aware of Sicario and I'd seen it. Thought it was a very good film. I think even more highly of it now. But yeah, Arrival, when I saw that, and I think I don't remember exactly when the news came out that he was going to direct Blade Runner 2049.
Very shortly thereafter.
Yeah, it was close enough to Arrival coming out that I was like, oh my God, it's going to be incredible. I had no doubt in my mind. And I wasn't even that big of a fan of Blade Runner. I admire the film a lot, but I'm not one of its super fans.
Yeah.
But I knew that just based off of Arrival, that 2049 was going to be something incredibly special. And sure enough, I had the experience that many people talk about having with the original Blade Runner with 2049. And it's the movie in my adult years that I've seen the most in theaters. When I was younger, the days of going to see Fellowship of the Ring like 14 times in the cinema, those days are gone. But I went to go see Blade Runner 2049 about 4 times in the theater, which is a lot for me in this era. And it became instantly like one of the most important films in my movie going experiences. So so even not having read the book Dune, or at least I think by that point I had made an attempt to get into it, and I wasn't quite melding with it, but I knew just based off the fact that it's Denis Villeneuve, I'm gonna love it. It's gonna be spectacular. And it's just he's a filmmaker that I like, just makes me so excited. And the fact that he has become like one of the greatest science fiction directors, of all time, just is like, that's incredibly gratifying. Just because I love to see this genre taken to this level. And I like all kinds of different, science fiction movies, but it is really cool to see someone who, in my opinion, is kind of picking up that mantle from the Ridley Scott, especially the stuff that he was doing back, in the late 70s, early 80s with Alien, with Blade Runner, and I just
it's a vindication for Denis Villeneuve, because as we have both alluded to, Blade Runner 2049, we both adore it. We have both expressed the view that it is one of the best movies of the 2010s, if not someone argue the best. I would put it on a very, very short list. I thought
it was me. I was the one who argued that.
And I'm not far off. And I thought it was a masterpiece when I walked out of the theater. I was just kind of in awe after I did so. And the movie was rightly acclaimed. It won 2 Oscars. It was nominated for 5. But as you mentioned, it did not do financially well at the box office, which was crushing. It was heartbreaking, because it was one of the best visions of a blockbuster cinematic auteur taking over a franchise and taking it in a new and elevated direction. This will be controversial to many who hold the original Blade Runner dear to their heart, because I do love the movie as well. I think Blade Runner 2049 is better. But it was, kind of a tragedy that, like the original Blade Runner was famously not a box office success. Blade Runner 2049 also did not match that level of success. And sometimes when that happens, a director who made that kind of movie has to go into director jail for a while with the studios, because it's like, you bet big and you lost, and now we aren't going to give you that kind of budget again.
I was so scared that was going to happen.
And Blade Runner 20, I think Benny managed to avoid that because Blade Runner 2049 was so artistically successful that he was able to secure outside financing and things, that it didn't end up becoming a black stain on his resume that would prevent him from doing future work. And we know that the movie's great. Then he's made comments like he kind of wish he hadn't gone into that franchise because he thought, and I'm like, no, you absolutely should have, and I'm glad.
Well, no, there's been some clickbait articles about some comments that he made. It's not, if you actually listen to his comments, it's sort of understandable what he is saying, but the articles written about it have just twisted it. And it's in any case, regardless of, I think we both believe that it's just one of the best science fiction films ever made, and if I ever get the chance to speak to that man, I'm going to tell him how much I absolutely adore that film.
Yeah, and I think that time has borne that out, that it is considered, for its artistry and its power in the cinematic medium. But what I kind of lead up to with that is, sometimes when a director makes a movie like that and it doesn't financially succeed as much as you would like, they kind of take a personal step back and they reevaluate and like, okay, I'm gonna go make a smaller, more personal film, and where the stakes are lower. Denis Villeneuve did not do that. His next project after Blade Runner 2049 was he was going to adapt Dune, which not only is one of the most beloved science fiction books ever written, it is one that has been borne out to be notoriously, legendarily difficult to adapt. No less a filmmaker than David Lynch tried in the 1980s, and as much as David Lynch is a masterful auteur and his, has great vision for kind of strange cinema in that way, his adaptation of Dune, I have seen it. It is not his best movie, not even close.
And it's a shame because if you think of David Lynch as an artist, like that sounds like a really interesting combination. And I know the film has its fans. I haven't seen it myself, but I've seen images from it.
Yeah.
And apologies to all of you who are fans of that version. I'm like, no, thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, and some of that I don't hold against him, because it was the time. It did come out in the 80s when they didn't have that quite level of cinematic artistry. Was in the wake of Star Wars. It didn't quite measure up in that way. But he also was not the first one who had tried to do it. Famously, the filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky also tried for years to adapt Dune, and he never even got his version off the ground. But and not for lack of trying, that it was a whole cinematic odyssey that unfortunately didn't lead to a film that we can see. Although there's a good documentary about it, but what I would say is that Dune is difficult to adapt for so many reasons. And when I looked at David Lynch's attempt to adapt it, I was like, I can see why this isn't successful. But after seeing this adaptation of Dune, I have an even better understanding about why David Lynch's version did not perhaps work quite as well. And it's because Denis Villeneuve had a vision for how he wanted to adapt this notoriously difficult story, and he committed to it fully, and he got the vision and the budget and everything that he needed. Against all odds, he bet on himself, he bet big, and he won. Has won massively, because splitting this movie up into two and talking about potentially completing it with a trilogy is the kind of thing you can only do if you absolutely are confident that what you are doing is going to bear out fruit. Because famously, he did not have a guarantee he would get to make this part two when he made part one. He had to prove it. And his Dune Part One was a massive success, despite the fact it had to release in the middle of a COVID pandemic where they had to do day and date release on HBO Max. But it was successful enough that he managed to get the green light to make this movie. And this movie not only completes the story from the first book, but it elevates the first movie in such a way that just makes you see this is what the vision was, and only a filmmaker of Denis Villeneuve's caliber could have done this. And that's why it's such a triumph.
Yeah, what's so interesting about this film in particular, which we now will finally get around to talking about, sorry, but we needed that lead up, is that these two films are very much, one whole. But I strongly feel that this second part is a virtuoso triumph onto itself, in a way that part one is phenomenal. It does also feel like the setup and first half of the story. And somehow this feels like, if part one is an appetizer, this is like a full course. And it's beautiful, all put together. But like I was just watching this in the theater and being like, and it has its own structure in a way that makes it feel like its own unique beast. It has like, it has these, all films have their, like 3-act structure and all that, but this you could really feel like the acts and the building up towards something. Like when the film switches, about a third of the way through to, Feyd-Rautha and the Harkonnens, it just feels like everything amps up to another level. And it's just, yeah, I draw a comparison actually to the novels, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. A Feast for Crows feels like, sort of half a story.
Mm-hmm.
And then A Dance with Dragons, you'd think just would be like the other half of the story, but it actually feels like multiple amazing books all in one. And, and that's sort of the, what I feel like this movie just feels like so many, wonderful feasts in one, sitting. And, it's just, and I hope dearly that we get Dune Messiah.
We will.
Yeah,
I think it's
it's a question of when we'll get it. Because, and also reading up a bit on the Dune Messiah without trying to spoil myself too much, I see that it will actually be a much different story than I anticipated when I got to the end of this movie. So we'll see if Denis wants to do another project, before tackling that or what. But that's, that's up to him. He's earned it, with this, because, he just pulled off such a masterful achievement with this. And if he wants to let it sit here for a little bit, then he's earned that right. But between you and me, I'd say the faster the better. I'd love to get that in that third film. But anyway, so yeah, now that we've sort of gone with an overview of, I have kind of broken down. I've got my little document here, our discussion is into sections, because this is not like a usual discussion for us,
Yeah.
where we know every beat of a movie in full detail and we can just sort of wing it. So I did want to have a little bit of structure to our conversation here.
Very wise.
Because, like I wrote in on social media, it almost feels to me like, a fever dream or a spice induced dream of having seen this movie. It reminds me of when I was younger, before like movies were so quickly available to watch, or even before I was like decided that I was going to start going to see movies, like double digit times in theaters. um, and especially having listened to the soundtrack so many times this week, and once again before watching this, I'm reminded actually of another experience with a Hans Zimmer soundtrack, which was Gladiator.
Yeah.
All the way back in the day. And that was when there was a much longer span of time between a movie being in theaters and coming out on video. The soundtrack back then, especially for that film, was like my home video version of the movie, where I remember I had a stereo system in my room. Nowadays it's all headphones listening on the iPod or the iPhone. But back then I had an actual stereo system in my room, and I would put the CD in, and that was such a beautiful soundtrack presentation of like almost like a symphonic version of the music, with tracks sort of flowing into each other. And so I would just sort of lock my door. I'd say to my parents, "Don't bother me for the next hour." And I'd just listen to the score for the film and experience the movie in that way, since I couldn't experience it any other way. And I almost feel like that's the experience I've been having this week since I saw the movie in the theater. And in a way, it's just it's made me like fall in love with this in a way that I haven't experienced in a while, because nowadays, usually if I want to re-experience a movie, I just run out to the theater again. But yeah, so this is leading me into like the next phase of our conversation, which obviously, I don't want to make this all about like the technical aspects of the movie, because this movie is filled to the brim with like the writing is phenomenal, the performances are out of this world. But we got to talk about Hans Zimmer and the score, because holy shit. And I'll admit the score to the first film took some getting used to for me, because I'm very much, as everybody knows, I'm a fan of symphonic scores.
Yeah.
And Dune is not that. It's, Hans pretty much created some new instruments just to make this score for both films. And there's even like a lot of it has like a rock sensibility to it, and then occasional bagpipes too, thrown for good measure. And it's just the first film was wild in how different it was, and so much of it was like just taken to extremes, and there was a lot of like exotic instruments used, and just like things that you wouldn't expect. And this film, I feel like it did so many things wonderful, but its secret weapon is the theme for Paul and Shawnee. That's sometimes it's used with the duduk instruments, synthesizers, and when it did that, it reminded me a lot of Blade Runner, I have to say. And then sometimes it's female vocals, which just make the theme soar. And what's great about the theme is like it's not a strictly romantic theme, it's actually a very mournful theme. And when you get to the end of the movie, like it's tragic. And it's not like the theme has been turned into something tragic. It's been a tragic theme all along. And it's, it represents so much. It represents their love for each other. It represents their trust in each other, their two cultures coming together. And it represents the tragedy of, of Paul's fall and the betrayal that Shawnee feels. And it's so complex, and it's all bound up in that beautiful theme. And I think just the way the film ends with that music is just out of this world. And that's, I feel like it's the emotional heartbeat of the movie that is amazing as the score for part one was. It didn't have that. And so I just thought it soared, and it just made the movie so incredibly impactful.
Yeah. The technical term we're going to put in as our word for the day is leitmotif, because that is what that piece of music is. It's a piece of music that is very much associated with a character, or in this case, a pair of characters, and with an idea and the theme, and it plays throughout the movie at key parts, sometimes in grand and sweeping and orchestral fashion, like when Paul and Chani have their first kiss on the dune. But it also plays at very subtle moments during the relationship, and just almost a quiet undercurrent, because the movie wants you thinking about it and subliminally, unconsciously associating it with these two characters and their love story and the conflict between them, because there is conflict. It is a conflict that rises to the surface over the course of the movie, not in necessarily the way that we would think of as like a traditional conflict between adversaries, but in this case, they are in some ways ideological opponents, but they also love each other very sincerely and very, very truly, and that lasts right up until the very moment when it can't. And the big reason that we want this piece of music to be so defined for us is because when we reach the end of the movie, as you alluded to, and the tragedy of the vision that we've been watching slowly unfolds, the music comes in, and it comes in loud, and it comes in heartbreaking, and it just tears us apart. And that's by design, because you alluded to the fact that with musical scores, there are scores that kind of can serve different purposes or different structures with the movie, because there are musical scores that you really have a hard time separating from the movie itself. You listen to it completely out of context, and you're like, I don't like, this is either discordant, like the movie we just talked about last week, The Witch. Incredibly effective score. Not one you would ever necessarily want to listen to separate from the movie, because it's designed to unsettle you in conjunction with the images on screen. Then
you don't know some of the scores I listen to on the respective albums.
John, you have a conflict. I say that with but I would say that and then there are pieces of music that are just absolutely beautiful in and of their own right. Famous musical compositions. I personally could name a bunch from movies that we love, like Star Wars, Pirates of the Caribbean, but in particular something like Lord of the Rings, which you compared these Dune to in many ways. And one of the ways I think this is most apt is that the musical score can tell you the story of the movie on its own. And it works better when you associate it with the incredible visuals, but the story is in the music. And that's one of the one of the reasons that Hans Zimmer's work across both of these movies is so indelible. He rightly won an Oscar for the first Dune movie, and Hans Zimmer, as people well know, he can be a controversial figure for scoreheads because sometimes he operates, unlike, say the maestro John Williams, he operates much more in a like collaborative fashion, and sometimes like when you see his name on the score, it's not always him composing the absolute majority of the music. But in this case, he is front and center because this is the type of movie that just really, like when you think of a Hans Zimmer score, you probably think of the Pirates of the Caribbean scores, which he famously oversaw and then kind of took over. You think of The Dark Knight, you think of The Lion King. Dune is up there now.
My favorite thing about the soundtrack album for the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie is that it doesn't, Hans Zimmer doesn't have credit for that score. It's Klaus Badelt, but there's a credit on the album that says score overproduced by Hans Zimmer. And yeah, now I'm less of a fan of his culture of like film scores, the like his school of composers that and then the people who have sort of taken after him, because there's I think another composer who is like not associated with his I think I forget what his sort of group is called, or remote control something, or and this other composer I think referred to someone who replaced him on a film series. I won't say which series. Said I was replaced by a Zimling. And so I don't like that because there's a lot of like his pupils who like tried to do the Hans Zimmer sound, but I never want my sort of distaste for that and my feelings about some of those composers that I won't go too far into here. I don't want that to ever take away from the fact that I think that Hans Zimmer himself is an outrageously talented composer, and he has his own style without a doubt. But I've loved his music since, way back, like, all the way back to when I was a kid watching Days of Thunder. And the score he composed for that movie, which is such a fun score. And, and Gladiator was one of the formative, like it's one of the soundtrack CDs that I had that just made me a film score fan. So you're never going to get, as much as he has a different style from most of the composers that I idolize, I'm never going to like talk smack about him because he is a genius. And as much as these scores for Dune are very different from my typical favorite kind of scores, they're still utter genius and brilliant. Especially this one, because like I said, I feel like this score has the secret weapon of the emotional theme for Paul and Shawnee, which is unique to this one, and just breaks the heart as you're watching the film. So yeah, I think he went above and beyond for these films and created a very unique soundscape for both movies that is totally fitting. And that's what I'm all about for film scores. Like Howard Shore wrote the exact perfect score for The Lord of the Rings. And it's my favorite score of all time, shocker. But that kind of score is suited to that project.
Yeah.
That kind of score would not, have suited Dune. Probably. we'll never know. But I think what Hans Zimmer has done is just so brilliant, for these movies, um, and yeah, it's a large part of the impact, that these films give, and I don't know, I'm out of superlatives, so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, it is a score that blends that very effective balance that it can be difficult to for certain composers to navigate, of a score that feels alien to us because this is a distant world at a distant time. It should feel somewhat strange to us, but it also feels incredibly familiar because it is a composer on earth composing it to us here, and he manages to do that by bringing in instruments that we here in the Western, world may not be quite as familiar with, and playing them in ways that sometimes feel a bit unconventional to the way our ears have typically been trained. But then the music is ultimately emotion, and music is sense memory. And the way he manages to pair these strange alien sounds with the visuals that we're seeing on screen, that's what delivers the kind of the raw, sweeping power that we associate with a score like this in a movie like this. So it's incredibly effective and impressive work. And Hans Zimmer himself deserves credit for that, because this is one of those scores that I feel, takes a little bit more direct ownership of. And he's a brilliant composer in and of his own right. And this is, in a long and distinguished career, this is a highlight.
Yeah. Another little thing that I wanted to mention about the music is, I love that there's enormous depth to what he's done, in part because of a bit of genius on his part, that back when part one came out, he released a separate album for his music, which was called the Dune Sketchbook, which had a lot of like fully fleshed out ideas of like themes and textures and all that. Not all of it is the most soothing stuff to listen to, but it was a testing ground for the music. And I remember after seeing part one, one of the things I was struck by was that there were aspects of some of the themes, notably the Bene Gesserit theme, that were kind of left off the table in part one. And if you listen to scenes in part two, I'm thinking of when Jessica is becoming the Reverend Mother, when let me I'm absolutely going to get all the names on this stream. When Léa Seydoux' character, Lady Margot Fenring, is seducing Feyd-Rautha, and you hear the theme a bit more prominently there. But it's still like, it's almost is still in the shadows. It's not like as out there as what you hear on that Sketchbook album. And I kind of like that, because it feels musically very much like the Lord of the Rings in Tolkien's larger mythology, of like where the Lord of the Rings is this big, massive, story that we all know, but it's only like a small piece of the larger mythology. And so in a way, I feel like some of the musical touches throughout the film are just that. They're hinting at something larger that Hans has fleshed out elsewhere, and maybe we'll hear even more of if there's when we get the third movie. So I kind of like that he allows that he went above and beyond what's even in the film itself in composing the music. So yeah, just absolutely brilliant work, and I'm sure we'll mention the music more as we go through the stream. But I really did want to devote some time to talking about it. Well, okay. Next, I was going to say let's talk about Paul and Shawnee, but we already did that a bit while talking about the music.
we can also we talked about it in relation to the musical theme, but
Yeah.
I think we can go deeper than that, because the thing about Paul and Shawnee is that they are the literal and figurative heart of this movie, not just because they are the central love story, but because Paul is our protagonist and Chani is kind of elevated in many ways to be his ideological foil in some respects, although they don't start out that way, which is one other thing that makes that dynamic interesting. Because, you know, in the first movie, Chani was very much, you know, we saw a couple scenes with her in the flesh, but she spent most of the movie as kind of this haunting figure of Paul's dreams. You know, when he begins to have his dreams of Arrakis all the way back on Caladan, he sees Chani and he doesn't know her name. He doesn't know who she is. He just sees this striking, beautiful young woman in the deserts of Arrakis, and he, you know, is entranced by her, rightly so. But the first Dune movie actually opens with Chani and her narration and her speech about her planet Arrakis being so beautiful when the sun is low, and she is the one.
And when we get a reprisal of that line in this film,
yeah, which is
so beautiful,
which is wonderful. But she also is the one who gives us the context about the nature of Arrakis and the fact that it is being oppressed by outsiders, by the Harkonnens. But until, as she says, one day they were gone. But then the prologue of the movie opens up with, you know, she's not glad that they're gone. She asked the question, who will our next oppressors be? And that is Chani herself. That's not the vision of Chani that Paul sees in his mind, because the Chani that we meet at a little bit at the end of Dune Part 1, but throughout this movie, is a woman who is fiercely devoted to the ideal of freedom for her people, for her world, and for her ideas about what it is to be Fremen and to be, you know, to have agency in that respect.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say this movie really sort of opens up, because we don't get a full sense of, you know, what her beliefs are in the first film. You know, where, like, in retrospect, we certainly get, you know, hints about that when she says, you know, who will our next oppressors be? And she also says, I don't believe you're the Lisan Al Gaib, you know, but that could, you know, it's seeing the first film, I was just like, oh, she doesn't think he's, you know, it's Paul. But in truth, she doesn't want a figure like that coming up. We get a very clearly defined picture in part 2 of someone who is not devout, who is, you know, who cares about her people and, as you say, wanting freedom for her people, but has no interest, you know, in any kind of messianic figure, or, you know, and no desire for one. And it's very interesting because it's, for someone who is not familiar with the story, it almost puts me on the back pedal of like who turns out to be the devout follower and who doesn't. I might have thought that that Shawnee would be a bit more, you know, sort of a follower to Paul, and that Stilgard would be the sort of gruff, you know, skeptic, based on what I saw in part 1, and the fact that it turns out to be the exact opposite. And oh god, I have so much to say about poor Stilgard. He's such a tragic figure.
We'll get to him. We will get to him.
But it's so interesting just to to see the dynamics at play, and that Shani comes to really respect and then love Paul and believe in him as Paul Atreides, and she says, and her read on him is that he's sincere. She says as much, and she believes that he doesn't want, to be any kind of messiah, or uh, and doesn't lust for power in that way. And so when that betrayal comes later in the movie, it's such a gut punch. And and that's why, like, I talked about this with the music, how the music is more than just a love theme, and I feel very much about the story that's being told here. It's so much more than just a love story between two characters, because it's a dynamic between two people from different cultures who are, who are finding their way to each other, to an understanding. And so that betrayal is as much a betrayal to, uh, to her on a sort of, a level of their common understanding, just as much as the love that they share. It's, she had a respect for him that, and he just betrayed everything that she stood for. And I can't wait to talk about, like, I know there's been a lot of, you've alluded to off camera, there's been some very bad, uh, bits of conversation related to comparisons between this and Star Wars. But I'm going to take that in a positive direction and say that I think there's a lot of, like, commonalities in terms of, good commonalities in terms of these, respective characters in both franchises, giving into their fear, and where the path that leads them down. Because at one point in this movie, in one of his visions, Paul sees, a terrible fate coming to Shani, and I think he lets his fear on that drive him in a direction that he shouldn't go down, and and it goes, succumbs to his own dark side. And and it's just, and the fact that, and I'm coming to I'm sure these things have been analyzed for years and years and years, but having not finished the book, I'm not privy to all those conversations, but just that mantra of fear is the mind killer, and ultimately I think Paul gives into his fear.
Yeah,
and he pays the price for that.
Yeah, and that is absolutely the case. And I know that you're reading the book. I read it many years ago. No specifics, but I will just offer one slight bit of context. This dynamic between Paul and Chani is a change from the book. Okay. So it is something, like, there are elements of it that are grounded in story materials, but Chani is given much more agency and character and independent character motivation in this film than she is in the book.
I've gathered as much. I wasn't sure to what extent, but I'm sure, just given the fact that the book was from the 60s and this is a film in the 2020s, I'm sure that there is.
And I think that's to the movie's benefit. I don't see that as a betrayal of the book story in any way, because as Eric points out in the chat, Chani is much more passive in the book, and you need to have characters on screen take action. They can't just be pure servants of another character's story. And Mateo puts in the chat this line about this prophecy is how they enslave us, and how it's such a good distillation for Chani's character in this movie. And I 100% agree, because when you delve into the whole nature of this messianic figure that the Fremen fundamentalists believe Paul to be, and how it intersects with the Bene Gesserit prophecy of the Kwisatz Haderach, and you think about the term that they constantly chant at Paul throughout this movie, Lisan al-Gaib, which literally means voice from the outer world, which it sounds mythical, it sounds powerful, it sounds like an angel coming down to deliver, someone who's being oppressed. But it also, in Chani's interpretation, it means literally that. Voice from the outer world, as in a voice from someone who is not from our world and our culture, who has insinuated these beliefs and is using them to control us. As she rightly calls out Stilgar and
which, of course, is the truth.
Is the truth. Because as they write, and one of the reasons that she and Paul see eye to eye at the beginning, Paul sees this. Why? Because his mother is a Bene Gesserit, and they are the ones who seeded this prophecy on Arrakis centuries ago in anticipation of the arrival of the Kwisatz Haderach, which turns out to be Paul, but was not. There was always a possibility that it might not have been Paul, and once Jessica drinks the water of life and she undergoes a fundamental change, she becomes much more like, well, yes, of course, it was always my son, and he is this voice who will lead the people on to rise up and fulfill this prophecy. It is exactly. And part of the reason that it's so powerful is because at the beginning of the movie, Paul sees this for what it is. He confronts his mother after she has become the Reverend Mother and taken on the water of life and is, now having creepy philosophical conversations with her unborn daughter. He tells her to her face, it's not a prophecy, it's a story. And that is what he truly believes at this time. And one of the reasons that he and Chani develop this respect for each other and fall for each other is because he wins her respect as a man, as Paul Atreides, the Duke of Arrakis's son, who has been cast out and betrayed, but who proves himself as a Fremen Fedaykin, as a fighter, as a member who wants to be one of their culture. And when he takes on the names Muad'Dib and Usul, names that they give him and names that he chooses, those are them welcoming him into their culture because he has proven himself as Paul, not as the Lisan al-Gaib. Throughout the background, we have Stilgar and Lady Jessica kind of offering these whispers, but Chani and her friends, they don't see him that way. They have skepticism of him, but then he proves his worth, and that's when she falls for him. And
let me just take a pause right there. And I know we're going to talk about the character in more detail later, but I just, one of my favorite parts of this movie is when Stilgar is having an aside with some of the other Fremen, and he's like, the Mahdi is too humble to say he is the Mahdi. Even more reason to believe he is, as written.
That is, for my money, both the funniest line in the entire movie and one of the most tragically foreshadowing. Yeah. Because, of course, Paul is at this point not just too humble to say that he is the Mahdi, he truly does not believe that he is. And the path that he takes to becoming that character is not a path that where he, reluctantly accepts it as, the destiny he must undergo. It's born by tragedy. It's born by loss. It's born by the reality that they're fighting this war to try and free Arrakis from the Harkonnens, and as an undercurrent to that, to get revenge for the death of Paul's family and his entire house. But the thing that makes Paul ultimately go south, which he does not want to do for the majority of the movie, is the fact when the Harkonnens finally get the step on them and they attack Siege Tabor and they destroy it in horrific fashion, and Paul couldn't see it because his visions are not as clear. And that's when he kind of reluctantly realizes that they don't have any choice. But the moment he goes south, that's when destiny, if you want to call it that, seizes him in his hands. And that was Chani's fear, because when she doesn't want him to go south and he doesn't want him to go south, they have that line about, you know, she's like, you will never lose me so long as you stay who you are. And that was always his goal. But at a certain point, he, you know, the tragedy of it is that he can't, you know, he gets swept up in this moment. And when he does choose to embrace his destiny, it's under circumstances where you can see the steps of like, could this have gone any other way? Perhaps if they were willing to not, you know, to take some risks, to take the harder path. But Paul was motivated by love, you know, like Darth Vader, another Star Wars connection. He fell because of love, because he loved Chani, because he grew to love the Fremen, because he grew to love Arrakis. He did not want to see them fall when enslaved by the Harkonnens, and he thought this was the only way. And in doing so, he gained terrible power. And the tragedy of Paul's tragedy is that in many ways, it is power that he embodies, but it is power he does not control. It is a wildfire that he has unleashed that will not be able to corral.
Yeah, and like we're able to see early on that this is not something Paul should do. Just looking at what it's done to Jessica, because oh my God, talk about it again. Hadn't read the book yet, and I still haven't gotten to that part. So you know, I'm getting used to part one Jessica. That's like the fierce, you know, mother bear, and I'm like, hell yeah, and. But then like she just once she drinks that water of life, you know, she goes like full on, you know, fundamentalist, you know, religious, you know, leader, and like you can still see, you know, shades of, you know, who she is, you know, in there, but it's, you know, we want to draw connections to, you know, another, you know, story, which is, you know, definitely took some inspiration from Dune. Look at Catelyn Stark, Lady Stoneheart. Maybe not as extreme. She's not a walking corpse, but in some ways she is, because, you know, the whole, you know, death and reborn and, you know, all that stuff. You know, it's. Yeah, I have like read up on this. I'm glad that they went the way that they did in the movie. It'll be interesting when I get to that part in the book. But like what they did in the movie was creepy enough. I'm like, I don't need to see some freakish, you know, killer baby going around.
Couple of connections to the witch there with Freaky Demon Child and leading into Anya Taylor-Joy in this movie.
Which, by the way, like just completely amazing that like they brought her in for this. Not sure how that's going to work with the next film, because unless they change how long passes. Or I don't know, it's some weird, freaky, you know, adult-minded baby. So maybe they can do some cheating as far as the age process. But they absolutely must have Anya Taylor-Joy, and
they will. This is the kind of thing where, because Denis Villeneuve's so confident he's going to make the third movie, he can seed in what is effectively an uncredited cameo role in Anya Taylor-Joy playing Paul's sister Aaliyah, who becomes a major character in Dune Messiah and the subsequent books in the series. Get her in there early, because she will be a part of the third movie. Just to answer,
we're both such huge fans. Like, were you jumping up and down?
Oh yeah, and the thing is, I don't care about this, because again, spoilers do not ruin my enjoyment of any well-crafted story. Anya Taylor-Joy being in this movie was spoiled for me by a Hollywood Reporter article or something. when they revealed that she was walking the red carpet, had a secret role in the movie, and I started thinking, well, who could she play who hasn't already been in the castles? And I'm like, oh, she's going to be Aaliyah Atreides. That's who she's going to be, and that is who she is. And I think it's perfect casting for, especially knowing the larger role that character will play in Dune Messiah going forward.
Can I just say that I was happy to get Anya Taylor-Joy instead of like creepy adult-minded baby walking around.
Oh yeah, and see that is one of the things that the original, that the David Lynch Dune movie does do, and you can find
I've seen pictures. I've seen pictures of that, and it weirded me out. I was like, I do not know how I'm going to handle that when they get to that in the movie, and so I was so happy with the way they ended up doing it.
Yeah,
although baby in the womb talking to her mother was still creepy. But
it was effective way to be creepy without giving us the kind of the unreality breaking of having an adult of a 2-year-old walking around with the mind of a full-grown adult and committing murder, as she does in the book. Just to answer Mateo's question about what's going on with the kid that with the unborn Aaliyah Atreides and Jessica, basically, short version in science fiction jargon is when Jessica drinks the water of life, which is, kind of opens her mind and allows the sense memories of all of her ancestors to flow into her. The unintended side effect it has is it prematurely awakens the mind of the unborn daughter in her womb. So effectively, even though Aaliyah has not been born yet, she is now fully conscious with the mind of an adult woman, essentially. And that's why Jessica is able to talk to her and have fully coherent conversations with her. And it's kind of played as like a creepy device in the movie and a very effective one. But one of the unintended consequences of that they explore in the later books is because babies don't have the kind of psychic defenses for that kind of thing, it opens their mind to the possession of spirits of their past ancestors. And without spoiling specificities, that's something Aaliyah has to reckon with later in her life. So.
And they got some weird shit, don't they? I love the way it was done in the movie because yes, it was very creepy, but I thought it in a great way, like that kind of unnerving, like, oh shit, what's going on? And and I just love the concept of seeing this fetus but then this voice talking to Jessica, but then it turns sort of sweet when Paul sees the vision of her as an adult, and and so it's not creepy little baby, it's it's full grown Anya Taylor-Joy, which she's never creepy ever, because
no, never.
Never been creepy in her whole career.
It goes to the famous question: if creepy, why hot? So.
Oh God! So, all right. At what point did we wander away from talking about Paul and Shawnee?
Well, I think we got there because we were talking about the nature of this prophecy that is the thing that ultimately drives Paul and Shawnee apart, being a Bene Gesserit introduction, and the fact that Paul's mother is both her order and then later her herself are the ones actively seeding the destruction, these beliefs among the people. And the interesting.
I did want to mention real quick because we were talking about when Paul drinks from the water of life, and like one of the most effective slaps in cinema, because that's not because there's a couple ways to take that at first, because it's so a lot of times in movies that kind of slap is like why'd you do that? Don't stare me slap. This is, you've betrayed me. You've betrayed everything I thought we stood for together. And at that point, she's like, you know, I think she very much still has love for him leading up to the end of the film with the ultimate, betrayal at that point. But it's at this point where she decides, um, I thought we were in this together. We're clearly not. And she's still going to fight, but she's going to fight, as she says, for her people, not for him.
Yeah. And that tragedy is borne out by the fact that, as you say, this is a decision that after having them talking about it together for the entire duration of the movie and being very much aligned in their philosophical approach to the prophecy and their reluctance for Paul to take up this mantle of Messiah, when Paul finally does make that decision, he makes it without her. And the fact that Chani loves him and loves him still even after that happens is one of the great tragedies, because knowing that he was this potential figure of prophecy, if she truly didn't believe it, she could have just distanced herself from him from the beginning. But she opened her heart, she gave him a chance, and he found his way into her heart. And their love for one another in the beginning of this movie is very real. The scene when, for instance, Paul, successfully rides Shai Hulud, and you see the Fremen all cheering him on, and you see Chani's face, and she's just elated with absolute joy that he's managed to do this and take this final step to become accepted as one of their culture. And she calls him by his Fremen names, Usul and Muad'Dib, and in addition to calling him Paul Atreides. But she never deigns to call him the prophesied Messiah, and that's because it's a prophecy that can only be fulfilled if he chooses to fulfill it. And when he ultimately does, and he does so out of a desire for love to help the people that he's decide become one up with, that is it's a tragedy, because he, as I said, that's when he loses control. Because when he wakes up after he takes the water of life and is awakened to all these past memories, that's when he changes fundamentally, because in addition to having all the memories of the past, he can now see the future. He can see the path. He can see what he needs to do to avert the horrors, the possible horrors that await. And that is his sacrifice, but it's also a burden that he seems to embrace a little bit too willingly in many ways. And he's being encouraged by Jessica, because when after he does this and Chani is frustrated with Jessica and Paul, and she's getting ready to go off for the final battle, Jessica comes ostensibly to wish her luck, and Chani looks at her with just disgust and is like, I would wish you the same, but it seems you already won your battle. And she did, because this is what Jessica wanted. She when she agreed to bear Paul as a son, she did so out of love for her Duke, for Leto, because Leto really wanted a son and Jessica wanted to give him one, even though the Bene Gesserit ordered her to bear only daughters. And so she makes that choice out of love, but she also makes that choice out of perhaps some arrogance, the idea that perhaps I could be the one to bring forth the Kwisatz Haderach. And then she's confirmed and validated in that belief. And that journey is kind of echoed with Paul, because he makes his choice out of love, but once he seizes the mantle of, the prophesied Messiah, he sees the path and he sees what he can and must do, he becomes a very different character, and he becomes a much more terrifying character, and a much more deadly character. And that culminates all the way through to the end of the movie. But that scene, for instance, when he's staring down all of the the Fremen, and
Oh.
he's pulling them out, and then he bends, literally and figuratively bends them to his will. That's his dark side turn.
Okay, here, yeah. Let me. Okay, there's a couple lines from that scene that I'm gonna go ahead and recite. I just have to find them right here. I have a quotes page pulled up. Okay. When Stilgar, tries to, in order for Paul to speak, at that gathering, according to Stilgar, he has to take Stilgar's life, to, to have a right to speak. And he says, "Take my life, Usul. It is the only way." And Paul responds, "I'm pointing the way."
Mm-hmm.
And then when he gets up there, he reveals things that he knows about, specifically, one person standing there in, and of course, this is a room full of, even though I think they're all initially, they have a little bit of skepticism. This is a room filled with devout believers. And so, he says, "There is no one in this room who can stand against me. Your mother warned you about my coming. Fear the moment. But you think you could have a chance. But you are afraid. What if I could be the one? This could be the moment you've been praying for all your life."
Yeah, and it's just and it's just like that. There's such confidence and certainty, but also almost kind of like malevolent, undercurrent there, because it's like, or what? If someone had dared to stand up to challenge him in that moment, what would he have done? Because this is the Paul, like, in many ways, who is like what you would expect to see from an aristocratic noble who believes they have a right to these things. But that's not his character earlier in the movie. He's very worried about, taking up this mantle, and he doesn't want to. And in particular, with his love for Chani, when she's talking about the fact that, like, your blood is that of kings and dukes from, like, these royal lineages, here we're equal. And he tells her, I would very much like to be equal to you. And it's a sweeping and romantic line. That's when they have their first kiss. And he believes it in that moment. But after he sees the path, after he sees the way, after taking the water of life, and he gives that speech that you outlined, he has another line where it was in the trailer. It's treated as a triumphant moment, but in the movie, it's much darker. And he just bellows, "I am Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, Duke of Arrakis. Hand of God be my witness. I am the voice of the outer world, and I will lead you to paradise." There's no humility there. That is him declaring, "I am the one." And so he is. So he becomes. And he will rise even higher, because it's not enough at this point to become Duke of Arrakis, Lisan al-Gaib, voice from the outer world. He is going to become the emperor of the known universe. He is going to confront the previous emperor who betrayed him and his family. He is going to defeat his champion, and he is going to make him demand that he bow at his feet and surrender his crown and submit to him, and everyone in the galaxy must do so as well. And
now I'm not as well versed in the details of the prophecy. I'm sure I'll become more familiar with that stuff as I'm reading the book. But from an outward perspective, I'll answer this question with, once a messianic figure has, their followers in the grip of their hands, things do get a little bit shady in terms of, what, like all of a sudden, once you've decided in your heart that you're following this person. You pretty much follow them to the ends of the earth, you know. Yeah, it is, and that's why, again, you know, I go back to Stilgar. Just, you know, my heart breaks for that man, because he just becomes, you know, the most devout, you know, fanatical follower of Paul, and we love Stilgar. He's, you know, he's, you know, a wonderful character. He has some of the funniest lines in the film, actually, but he's also, you know, just a, you know, a very honorable person. But he's also very religious, and he gets, you know, pulled in. It's funny because when I saw the last film, the parallel that I drew as far as characters go, I connected him to. Hold on, because I'm not going to be able to remember the character's name, but I drew the comparison between him and Auda from Lawrence of Arabia.
Mhm.
He very much seemed to fit that archetype. Then I saw this movie. It was like, oh, no. He's much more of a, you know, devout follower than Auda ever ever was. Even though Auda follows Lawrence, you know, like, certainly never buys into him as some, you know, chosen one, or, you know, anything like that. So Stilgar, you know, is very much, you know, a fascinating character all his own, and yeah, it's just tragic to see that, and to see the fanaticism with which Paul eventually, you know, um, you know, it is followed around by, to the point where, uh, just the fact that the movie ends with, you know, the finals, like, stated dialogue, aside from, like, the voiceover, you know, at the end is, um, you know, with Stilgar saying, you know, what is your command? And he says, lead them to paradise.
Yeah,
Just
it is
amazing.
that is the hammer line. That is the movie's, like, absolute, the sterling point of this movie's devastating thematic spear is that line and that sequence, where Paul, you know, effectively orders his entire, now fanatically devoted Fremen army, to take up their arms and go cleanse the non-believers. And it's again, it's another element that's kind of from the book that is more alluded to but made more explicit here, and it's much more effective in the cinematic form. I personally feel, because it becomes less theoretical and more real, like real world. That, you know, what once a messianic figure rises to this level and has people willing to, you know, kill for them, it is only a matter of time before the figure uh, uses that power. And Paul does, you know, in this case, because after he has forced the emperor to bow and killed his enemies, the Harkonnens, and seized control of Arrakis, does he need all of the other houses to bow to him? Perhaps not, but in this moment he has the power to make them do so, and so he will. And that is, you know,
Yeah, it's because what Paul wanted was to, you know, his vision of, you know, convincing you know, making a play for the throne, as, you know, it's referred to in the first film, is for the sake of the other great houses and peace, to, you know, convince the emperor, you know, to to marry, one of his daughters to him, and to sort of avoid war, and the fact that this movie ends with, um,
The Holy War.
with him saying just, well, the hell with all that, let's just slaughter them all. Oh, man.
We'll circle back more to that development once we get to the ending scene. But yeah, it's incredibly powerful, and it's one of the reasons why this movie is being so widely and rightly acclaimed, because the movie has incredibly powerful visuals, it has great acting, it's immaculately well directed, great soaring music, but the reason it's resonating with people so much is because of this thematic idea that I think has kind of shocked people a little bit who didn't realize that this is kind of the story that Dune was always telling in its book, at least the first book, and here it is laid bare in all of its beauty and horror. And it's Denis Villeneuve knew that this was the idea that he wanted to tell, and he structured the entire movie to serve this idea and this moment.
Yeah. I would say, in response to Guilty's comment here, also, Frank Herbert himself was inspired by Lawrence of Arabia. So, so it's only natural that cinematically, we see that on screen, and yeah, that's always the pitch for this one. It's like I always say it's somewhere between Lawrence of Arabia, Star Wars, and Game of Thrones.
Yeah, and inspiration is not theft, folks. It's creatively, people are able to borrow ideas and make them their own. There's a reason that these recurring archetypes show up in all kinds of stories from all different cultures all around the world. Similarities do not mean one thing is derivative of something else. That's a reductive way to look at it. These stories are their own entities, and they live that way.
Yeah, if you're gonna get stuck on what took inspiration from Dune, I've got bad news for you about a lot of your favorite stories.
I have thoughts on that, as we have discussed off screen, but we don't need to bog the stream down with that. This is going to be a happy stream, and I promise we would not do that.
Yeah, let's do the mid roll. It's still we got plenty of stuff to get through here, and I was worried that we were going to struggle having only seen the film once, not in the least bit. So anyway, next week we'll be back to our usual Sunday night. And the switching of days will not be a regular occurrence. We just had to do it this week because there's something going on tomorrow night, and plus you have some other stuff going on as well, Jared. So it ended up being very fortuitous. But next week on Sunday we'll be talking about the 1995 Ang Lee film Sense and Sensibility, which would be great. Definitely changing gears there. And one of my mom's all-time favorite movies. So I'll be very happy to get to talk about that. And I love it quite a bit too. And then what do we have going on after that? Is it Batman Mask of the Phantasm?
It is indeed.
Yeah. So yeah, we've got a fun couple of weeks ahead. And I do feel like I have to mention tomorrow night, being the Oscars. As anybody here who is in our Slack group, if you're not doing anything tomorrow and you thought about watching the Oscars, join us for a watch party that's going to start at about 7:00. You can find details in the Slack. I thought that would be a fun way to do it this year. I've kind of been off and on with the Oscars for a few years, but I haven't really had the chance before to watch it with friends. It's usually just me watching, so I thought that would be a fun way to do it this year. And of course, I am watching this year because it looks like Oppenheimer is going to have a pretty big victory, you know. And if it doesn't, it'll be the biggest shock in years. But I don't think that'll happen. I think it's pretty safe. Um, and so that'll be fun just to see that. And I'm looking forward to, fingers crossed, seeing Christopher Nolan finally collect that Best Director Oscar. So, and then, you know, got my fingers crossed for a couple of wins for Poor Things as well. So, but yeah, no, anything you want to mention, Jared, before we get back into the conversation?
Yeah, no, just the fact that, you know, John and I have been having kind of extensive conversations about a bunch of things that we have planned for a couple months out, honestly, but we're only announcing a couple weeks ahead of time just because we want to leave room for some flexibility in case schedules shift or new inspiration strikes. So that's why we're only confirmed the next 2 weeks out loud with Sense and Sensibility, our nice little palate cleanser with romantic period drama. After, you know, a couple weeks of religious fundamentalism, and then Batman: Mask of the Phantasm, which is an all-time classic animated movie that we both love dearly. Then the week after that, John is going to have his annual birthday stream where he gets to, you know, gets to pick the movie, and then and all I'll say in terms of other things that will definitely be covering is at some point we will be returning to discuss Star Wars: The Bad Batch, and because we are still very much excited and loving that show. We just had a great episode this past Wednesday. They're all great. But we're going to do a mid-season check-in at some point, or maybe like a 2/3 of the season check-in, and then another discussion after the finale. So.
Yeah, we tentatively have something for my birthday stream, but I'm reserving the right to switch that out for the Bad Batch if that week happens to leave off on a big episode. But we'll see. Hey, the things, you know, always in motion. The future is.
Yeah, very wise, that guy.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive back in. So yeah, we did talk a bit about Jessica. Like I was saying, it really took me off guard where she went very early in this movie, and I felt just really sad for her because it's a big thing to be burdened with the knowledge of like not only the past but all like possible futures and all that stuff, and it automatically pulls you away a bit from your humanity, like and this is, you know, what awaits Paul later in the film. It's really no surprise then where both of these characters kind of go, but I went from like really loving Jessica in a kind of, you know, like, oh, she's a badass mom, you know, kind of way, to being scared of her for the majority of this movie.
Which is a degree that Rebecca Ferguson can play incredibly well. You know, she's a brilliant actress. She can play very warm and kind. She can also play badass, as we see in the Mission Impossible franchise. But if you want to see her play truly unambiguously horrifying, watch Doctor Sleep, the Shining sequel, because she plays a particularly terrifying villain in that, Rose the Hat, which I could see echoes of, sense memories perhaps, in her performance as Lady Jessica once she drinks the water of life and becomes the Reverend Mother, because we spend more time with Paul's conflict throughout this movie, because it's a long time before he finally takes up the mantle. With Jessica, you know, she drinks the water of life pretty early in the movie, and she doesn't want to do it. but once she does it, she never looks back. She becomes full-throated, religious zealot, but also a zealot who's using it to secure her own power and the ascension of her son and her family's future, and perhaps also to get revenge on not only the Harkonnens, but the Bene Gesserit, mothers who betrayed her. And the line of dialogue from her that I think is the one that really just speaks to the turn of her character is one of the lines of dialogue that's the most terrifying and effective in the film, because it really underscores just how manipulative she's being, is when she's having a conversation with her unborn daughter, Aaliyah, and we don't hear Aaliyah's side of the conversation, but we can assume she's whispering encouragement to her. And Jessica says to Aaliyah, "You're right. If we want to protect your brother, we need all the Fremen to believe in the prophecy. We must convert the non-believers one by one. We need to start with the weaker ones, the vulnerable ones, the ones who fear us." That doesn't sound like somebody who's doing this for the good of spreading, holy light and good cheer and bringing the good word to people. That sounds like somebody who realizes this is the means through which we can enact power. And one way to enact power is through, one of the most powerful motivators is through fear. And so she knows she's scary. She knows she's dangerous, and she is going to use that. And once she...
I'm sitting here watching, I was sitting there watching the movie and listening to a line like that, and I'm like, so am I rooting for these people?
Yeah.
No, it's terrifying. And of course, then, there's a scene later, the one you mentioned earlier when Paul says, it's not a prophecy, it's a story. But that conversation between the two of them in that moment, it's like, it's where Paul is still pushing to not be the Messiah. And you can see in that conversation, it's like, oh, my mother's a religious fundamentalist. This is this is not cool.
Yep. Freeze frame. Yep, you're probably wondering how we got into this situation. Well, it started when she drank the water of life, and then everything went to shit. But yeah, one of the interesting elements of it is you mentioned that you're like, are we supposed to be rooting for these people? And other than Chani, who is very much coded throughout the movie as somebody who we should still be sympathetic for, that's a question that the movie kind of works on us throughout its runtime, because the answer is both yes and no. Because we start out thinking Paul and his mother are very much in the right, because we just saw them in the previous movie, their entire family get betrayed. Yeah. Paul's father and Jessica's love get killed, and they were cast out into the desert to die, and then they found safe harbor with the Fremen, and we're like, this is the archetype of someone who's going to rise up, and they are on the side of right, they will get revenge. But then it all starts to go horribly wrong. But one of the reasons why we still root for them is that as bad as they can seem to go throughout the movie, the Harkonnens are coded to us as worse. And we'll get into why and how that is. It shouldn't be hard to see aesthetically, but we'll get into it thematically. But then the movie subverts that, because once Paul and Jessica take the water of the life, they realize something. They realize that Jessica herself is the daughter, unbeknownst to her until previously, of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen.
Not really, because because of my previous attempt of starting to read the book, I knew this, because it's kind of, it's strongly hinted at early in the book. So I did know this. I was just wondering when they were going to drop the ball in the film adaptation. And yeah, it's like at that point they're like, oh,
Yeah, and it's not a coincidence that they do that right at the moment when we start to see Paul and Jessica become much more aligned in using their power to enact vengeance, because Paul has that line to her out when he's sitting by the well after drinking the water of life and talking to Jessica about the realization of their bloodline, where he says to her, "We're Harkonnens, so we'll be Harkonnens." And from that moment on, they become much more ruthless in their approach. And they're doing
Yeah, he
it
says that's how we survive.
by being Harkonnens. Yeah.
Yeah.
And and that doesn't mean they're going to go align with the Harkonnens. No, on the contrary, they're going to use it to go kill all of the other Harkonnens. But they're, the Harkonnen philosophy is very much take what we want and kill anyone who gets in our way. And that's kind of what Paul and Jessica do once they're fully embracing the prophecy.
I just want to say, poor Leto. If there's an afterlife in this world, he's not happy right now. He's like, what the shit? Oh, and poor Oscar Isaac. This is the only glimpse.
Yeah, no, he
we get in the movie.
Yeah, he knew that he was going to be a one and done. And he is very much a tragic figure throughout the movie, because he really did have visions of when he came to Arrakis, when he was ordered by the Emperor to come to Arrakis and act as its steward, but really the Emperor was telling him, go there to die because you're becoming too powerful. And the Emperor actually gives his reasoning for that. When we catch up with the Emperor, his daughter Erulin says that my father loved Duke Leto like a son, but my father has always been motivated by calculations of power. And
yeah, he says to Paul, "Do you know why I killed him?
Yeah.
Because he was a man who believed in the rules of the heart, but the heart is not meant to rule. In other words, your father was a weak man."
Yeah. And we don't want to believe that, but in the very much the real politic of the world that they're trying to create, that is something that, say like George R.R. Martin would say, very much so.
Yeah, and I've always I push back on that, because that's only true because the scum of the story say that it is, and to me, Leto stands very tall.
Yeah,
as does Ned Stark. These were honorable men, who things don't work out very well for the Emperor or for the Harkonnens. So see where that got them. It's the tragedy of these characters that they're too good for the world in which they're a part. And and I just, what brilliant casting Oscar Isaac was for that character, because it's just his performance throughout the first film was just so wonderful, and and even though he's not in this film, his shadow is long. You feel the reverberations of his character throughout this film. Yeah. So okay, we can go one of two ways at this point. We can either go into talking about the Emperor and the princess, or we can talk about the Harkonnens. Who do you want to tackle first?
I think we should do the Harkonnens, just because they are our primary adversaries for much of the movie, and they lead into the discussion about the Harkonnens ultimately, because everything that we've talked about with regard to being very wary and suspicious and of the path that Paul and Jessica take in this movie, it works, as I mentioned, because throughout the movie, they still like, they're bad, but the Harkonnens are still like, there's nothing very redeeming that's presented about them. They are manipulative, they are psychotic, they are brutal, they are not nice people.
Yeah, let's just all right. Yeah, we have conflicted feelings about Paul and Jessica, but here's some unconflicted feelings about how evil these characters are.
Yeah.
No, and but I don't know. I imagine there probably are some for certain people. For some people, there are some very conflicting feelings about Fade Rotha, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm sure. I don't visit that corner of the internet though, so but yeah.
Yeah, no. This is like not the architecture of people who are complicated.
Yeah.
These are our baddies for the movie. And I love because this like stark contrast of like, set design and costume design and just like color scheme, like this is pure Denis.
Yeah.
Like this is not something that's as obvious in the book. And I love it because so much of like the design elements do have like are reminiscent of some things from Blade Runner 2049, and you can see that aesthetically it comes from the same mind, and so I was excited about that back when the first movie was coming out, and I loved it here, and I loved the fact that what they did with Getty Prime and how the sunlight actually drains color, from the world, which they did to differentiate Getty Prime from Arrakis, which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah,
and the arena scene is like I didn't get to see this in an authentic IMAX theater. Like it's it's the halfway between theater. It's digital IMAX, so it's a huge screen, but it's not 50-foot tall, IMAX screen. But this sequence, I was like, holy shit, this is enormous.
Yeah, the scale and the way that they frame it and the cinematography, as you mentioned, essentially drenching it in black and white overtones, where you're like, okay, Greg Fraser is going for his second cinematography Oscar here, and rightly so. It's beautiful. But the sequence the thing that I really think about is what Eric is pointing out here in the chat. I'm not a big wrestling fan, but I'm familiar with some of the tropes and the conventions of professional wrestling, and one of them is the idea of putting someone over, where you effectively stage a sequence or a battle or a match to make someone look good and kind of elevate them up as like the new threat. And it is notable that like after we've had Paul, and the Fremen warriors are coming together and they're winning these massive victories on Arrakis, and they're having victory after victory, and they're making poor Dave Bautista's Glossu Robin just look like a fool, and then Stellan Skarsgård has to elevate out of the slime pit to say you're failing, and then sink back into the bottom. When that has gone on long enough, the movie effectively stops. It takes us away from Arrakis, and it gives us a 15 to 20 minute sequence of like, oh, Paul thinks he can handle these guys. Let us introduce you to Fayed Rautha Harkonnen, because this dude is our baddest of the bad. And then they stage a little arena fight where he's supposed to be going up against the last members of House Atreides, and it's supposed to be all for show. But this guy doesn't do show. This guy does it for real. And look at him. He looks so nice and friendly. Where
It's
where did
Elvis Presley, y'all.
where did Elvis Presley's hair go? That's the other amusing. Well, I want to get back to Faye rather, but one of the amusing things I saw when they talked about his seduction by Lady Margot later in the movie, and they're like, all she did was show him a little bit of shoulder, and then someone retorted, "It's like, yes, of course she managed to seduce him. She's the first woman he's seen in years that has hair." And he's just
Wait. And is there any dispute that Léa Seydoux could,
she
seduce
could.
like any man instantly?
Oh, she absolutely could, and that's another reason that it's so effective. And obviously, I will caveat that, like, women can absolutely and are beautiful without hair, but the Harkonnen, slave women are meant to kind of just cower at Feyd-Rautha's feet, and Lady Margot is very much not. She has power and she has agency, and one of the interesting elements that she introduces is the Bene Gesserit in this, in sending her to seduce Feyd-Rautha, are effectively thinking, well, maybe he can be our Messiah. Maybe he can be our Kwisatz Haderach. And maybe we can control him, because one of the underlying elements of the thing is, one of the reasons that the Bene Gesserit signed off on the destruction of House Atreides was the Emperor and Mother, the Reverend Mother, thought, like, they're getting too hard to control. And of course, Jessica wasn't supposed to bear Paul as a boy. She was supposed to bear only girls, and they were supposed to marry that girl to Feyd-Rautha and create the Kwisatz Haderach. That was the Bene Gesserit's plan. But they're like, we can still work this out. Let's send our Lady Margot to go seduce Feyd-Rautha and secure the bloodline and figure out what levers we can use to control him, which in this case are sadistic pain and humiliation, and then we'll still be in charge here. Yes, exactly. And Feyd-Rautha knows that they're trying to use him, but he also kind of doesn't care, because really what he wants is to kill and to maim and to seize power. And when Vladimir Harkonnen comes back and, like, tells him, like, like on his birthday, he makes him fight to the death. And when Feyd-Rautha's like, you tried to kill me, and Harkonnen's like, details. I was trying to test your mettle, and now I have a new gift for you. I give you Arrakis. Go and crush the life out of these people. And Feyd-Rautha's like, and if you do that, perhaps you will one day be emperor. And Feyd-Rautha's like, I can work with this. And he does. He is incredibly effective. That's the whole point of this sequence, is it shows us just how dangerous the character of Feyd-Rautha is, because Rabban, his older brother, we know Dave Bautista from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. We know he can be, like, a very effective, warrior, but he's not put up to us as, like, the guy who is truly capable of understanding the insurgency to the extent that he can crush it. Feyd-Rautha very much is. From the moment he shows up, they start taking losses, and bad ones.
Yeah, he's the one. He's like, oh god, I'm getting echo. What is going on? I'm just gonna have to ignore that. That's the worst echo I've ever heard on here. No, like, immediately he goes for the pressure points. Like, he's not screwing around. And yeah, it's immediately, it's clear that he's cut out for exactly this kind of work, as as horrifying as it is. And all the more so because it's so horrifying. And and Dave Bautista is wonderful as Rabba, but he's clearly he's outmatched here.
Yes.
But a side note, I just love like the career trajectory Dave Bautista has taken. You know, I've been singing his praises for a couple of years now, but like I remember as soon as among all of Blade Runner 2049's other amazing qualities, like his performance in that film, although rather, you know, it was a small role, but he was just amazing in the first sequence of that film, and I was so glad to see him brought back for this. Um, and I am interested in reading the book that there's a lot more like background given to him and his adversarial relationship with Gurney Halleck, which they didn't quite have time for in the films. It's alluded to a little bit before their tussle at the end of the movie. But it's one of the nice things about reading the book afterwards is you get to fill in a lot of the gaps with this stuff. But
it makes me wonder if there was perhaps a deleted scene either in the first movie or in this movie that showed that a little bit more explicitly. Not that we will ever see it, because Denis has been very specific in the idea that when he cuts a scene from his movie, it breaks his heart, but he cut it for a reason, and he can't bear to see it.
I simultaneously respect that, and also it infuriates me.
Yeah,
because I would love to see some of the stuff that got cut here. But I do agree. I almost wonder if there was something from the first film that directly mentioned that. But that's okay. It's because, you know, I always say, like, no film is perfect. So there should always be one thing I can point at where I'm like, oh, I would have liked a little bit more of this. And I'm sure I'll have a different perspective on it after I read the book too. That'll be like a whole new experience for me that I'm looking forward to of rewatching the films after I've absorbed the book, because then I'll have the advantage of all the, you know, details. And from what I understand, there's a lot of stuff that actually didn't make it in. That I know Denis said he chose to focus on the Bene Gesserit in his adaptations, and there's a lot with the Spacing Guild and the Mentats in the books that are not in the films, and so I'm looking forward to getting all of that now that I'm reading the book. But anyway, so and that's another thing. I almost would have loved to have even more Fade Rotha, but the way they use him in the film is extremely effective. And, you know, and by the time we get to the end of the movie, which, by the way, I have to say, like, I feel like it's a trope that has been underutilized in years, or maybe it's been utilized and maybe it just hasn't been done so well. But I love movies that end with a duel.
Yes.
It's so much like, and don't get me wrong, this movie has like big action sequences and epic war scenes, and, you know, all the stuff that, you know, make you recall like epic sweeping shots from Lord of the Rings, or, you know, Star Wars, or any other movie. But what's great is this movie ends with such personal stakes. And to just have this knife fight, you know, between Paul and Fedorov is, you know, not that there's any like suspense about how this is going to turn out, you know, but it's just so like, I just love ending movies with this kind of fight where it's like you're just waiting for one wrong step. And it's why we love scenes like, you know, going to Game of Thrones with like the mountain verses, you know, over in Martell, and, you know, stuff like that. And the tension just ratcheted up with this, and I think it's a brilliant way to end the story.
I mean, we can call it what it is. This is trial by combat. It's literally, you know, they may not go by that name, but like literally when he makes the Emperor choose his champion, and Fayed Ralph is like, I will be your champion in a very dark way. But and there is suspense, at least I felt so, even though I knew from winning the book and just the
convention. Oh, there's suspense. I'm just saying we don't think there's like, just the way the story has been set up, like Paul's going to be the victor. But there's still suspense within that.
Yeah, and there's suspense because the movie has done its due diligence and established Fayed Rautha as a character who is worthy of that kind of build-up and that kind of, we know how dangerous and ruthless he is, and he gives Paul, the voice from the outer world, the San al-Gaib, the Kwisatz Haderach in full form, he gives him everything he can handle. And he gets his knife into him, and in another world, he may have killed him, and that could have ended the story of Lisan al-Gaib right there. But Paul, at this point, has seen the path, he has seen the way, and he knows what he needs to do to defeat Fayed Rautha, and so he does. And when he manages to kill him, and gets that nod of respect from Fayed Rautha, the callback, "You fought well, Atreides," before he dies. It's a satisfying moment in a conventional sense because Fayed Rautha was effectively the last of the Harkonnen bloodline that we had been introduced to. Paul has already killed the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. We see Gurney get his revenge on Raban, and the Harkonnens, who have been our adversaries for these past two movies, are now effectively vanquished. But as we see, that's not the end of the story. And I do want to just take a moment here to pay tribute to the actors who portray our three main Harkonnen villains, led by Stellan Skarsgård, who, a fantastic character actor who's been in so many beloved movies, not least of which recently, including, the TV show Andor, but he plays a truly monstrous character in these films, but he manages to do so while clearly being just someone who is ruthlessly intelligent and constantly thinking about the calculations of power. And he feels dangerous, even though he looks kind of ridiculous by design, given the fact that he can't walk on his own without the use of the repulsor lifts. But the malevolence and intensity in his stare, particularly in that sequence in the arena where he's making his nephew fight to the death to prove himself. It's an awesome performance. And then you mentioned Dave Bautista, who, started his career famously as a professional wrestler, but unlike a couple of other, actors who have taken that path and who have gone on to have very successful careers like The Rock and John Cena, Dave Bautista made a conscious choice. He did not want to do pure action vehicles and comedies. He wanted to work with auteurs. And yes, he did do Guardians of the Galaxy, but that was a very specific vision from James Gunn. And then he's gone on to work with Denis Villeneuve and Rian Johnson and a bunch of these directors who have given him very fully rounded, complex characters to play that are awesome, and let him show off his talent. And even though he in this specific movie, he plays much more of the heavy, who gets kind of, as I said, put over to make Fayed Rautha rise. It's still a great performance. And then Austin Butler, fresh off of his Oscar nomination for Elvis and well into his his era of kind of ascension of being a popular heartthrob leading man type actor, he chooses to take this role that almost renders him unrecognizable as a thoroughly irredeemable psychotic villain, and he just crushes it. And it's an awesome performance. He almost, in some ways, if the rest of the movie around him wasn't so incredibly strong and Timothy Chalamet wasn't so compelling as the lead and we had such a rich supporting cast, Fayed Rautha easily could have stolen this entire movie. But
Well,
instead,
and for a little while he does, because it's what I was talking about earlier, how like this movie almost becomes something completely different when he's introduced. It's the beginning of a new act of the story, and we leave the story that we've been following for the rest of the film for a good 20-25 minutes, and it's so focused on his character, and then it leads into like some of the politics with the other characters like the emperor and the princess, and he in a way resets the film at a certain point, and yeah, it would be very easy for him to just kind of take over everything if like everybody else wasn't on their A game so thoroughly in this movie. And yeah, no, it's just when he makes his appearance, it was like it made me like I was enjoying the hell out of the movie, but I kind of like eased into my seat, and I was watching, and then he enters, and it's like, oh, what's going on? Yeah, it's it just it's almost would almost be easy to like underappreciate what a magnificent job he does, because it almost looks effortless. But yeah,
yeah, it's they shoot him brilliantly. They give him like they basically give him the hero treatment for this entire 25-minute section of the movie, where he's lit like the hero, he's presented like the hero, even though he's doing clearly unspeakably evil, villainous things. He is treated as the protagonist of that sequence, which is fitting because he is effectively Paul's, dark mirror, what Paul could have been, what Paul may become, what, they have this kind of shared intermingling of destiny, given the fact the Bene Gesserit are like, Paul Atreides could have been our Messiah, but perhaps Fayed Rautha shall be. And then, of course, they have to duel to the death over that. But yeah, that only works because they found an actor of Austin Butler's charisma to portray this critical role, and they did everything they could to set him up to succeed, and he hit a home run.
Which, and side note, I have to say, like, it gives me a lot of pleasure just to see Austin Butler, rising to these heights, because one of the first things I saw him in was the fantasy TV series. Oh God, what was it called?
The Shannara Chronicles?
Yeah, the Shannara Chronicles. And shall we say that was a show that, like, I liked a lot of the design work of it, and I thought they did some interesting things, but it was not a show with like fantastic acting across the board, shall we say. But to see like what Austin Butler has been doing, in the last number of years, and to see him doing this, that it's just like, it was such an out of this world, wonderful performance, that just made you feel like immediately like radiating off the screen this, this loose cannon of a character, but also like instilling like this bit of respect for him as well, because just with the bookends of him, his you fought well, Atreides, and it's just, yeah, I thought he did an absolutely brilliant job. Which, side note, speaking of people that I'm proud to see, how far they've come, I want to give props to the screenwriter who worked with Denis Villeneuve, John Spates, who previously had written the first draft of the film Prometheus before Damon Lindelof came in, and because they didn't have enough, like the studio didn't have enough faith in John Spates as a screenwriter that was starting off, and so just to, and that movie got some flack for some of its screenwriting, and who's to say who wrote what, but I do feel like he got some flack for some of that. So to see him now, you know, uh, being, one of the main writers of this, adaptation of Dune, which is a soaring and towering success of writing, which may go undervalued just because of what a big, huge visual spectacle it is. But I think the scripts for these films have been fantastic. So big round of applause for him, because he's come out on top.
Yeah, no, and it's a real testament to the fact that the first Dune got nominated for an Academy Award for writing for Denis and for John Spates and for Eric Roth, who was a co-writer on the Dune Part 1, but actually is not credited on this one.
Yeah.
And Denis had made headlines a little while ago when he talked about, he's not the biggest fan of dialogue in some of his movies, and he was also got taken out of context, and he much prefers to tell stories with images and style. And I get what he's saying, but what I would also say is that one of the reasons these movies are such an impressive feat of writing is not just writing snappy dialogue. That's kind of what we tend to focus on, but it's also the way you wrangle structure and character for a movie of this sweeping and epic scale. That's the similar feat to what other epic stories that have been recognized for writing and adaptation, like Lord of the Rings, have been lauded for. The idea that how do you take this immensely complex, huge work of art in one medium and translate it effectively to another? Well, you find the thematic idea that carries you through, and then you build everything around it, and then you make sure you are not leaving the audience behind by helping to kind of structure the reveals of all the science fiction-y jargon in such a way that it becomes accessible. That's a feat of writing too. So I'm very impressed with the screenplays for these movies, even if there aren't quite as many flowery speeches, but there are still some great ones, like Lead Them to Paradise. Again, all-time hammer drop, line for near the end of the movie.
I will say, I think there are some showstopper lines, particularly in this film, and most of them are horrifying lines of dialogue. I also want to mention just about, with regard to the Baron, talking about the Harkonnens, the way he is ultimately dispatched is and again, going back to the changes that were made in this film with regards to adult-minded killer babies. I'm very happy they didn't go that route in the film, because and I didn't know about those changes before I saw the film. So I just took what happened in the film on its own merits, and oh my God, it was so it just felt so earned and so rewarding. Just when Paul goes up to me, he says, "Hello, grandfather," and just that look of realization on the Baron's face, and oh God, yeah, it was right up there with Arya Stark killing. Yeah, it's. God.
I personally, one of my favorite things in movies is when irredeemably or monstrously evil characters have a moment where everything around them comes crashing down, and they have to look the hero in the eye and realize irrevocably that everything I've done has led me to this moment, and now there's nothing that I can do, and now I'm going to die. And Stellan Skarsgård has a great one in that scene. And what I will say is that, you're right. They did make a slight change from the book, in the sense that it is Paul who dispatches the Baron and not baby Aaliyah. But while I do think perhaps we have seen the last of Dave Bautista's Raban and Austin Butler's Fayed Rautha, and incredible jobs to both, if they follow the story of the books, I do think there is a chance we have not seen the last of Stellan Skarsgård as Baron Harkonnen. So we shall see. Depends on how far they want to go down in the Dune Messiah / Children of Dune.
Yeah, I don't know. By my read of his comments, Denis is being very non-committal either way.
Yeah.
Like he said he would stop at Dune Messiah, but then he's kind of like, we'll see how I feel, down the line.
but so, even if he doesn't stop, I think there was a chance he could bring elements of the abomination storyline, shall we say, forward into Doom Messiah, because I do think, at least based on what I know of Doom Messiah's story structure, there is a chance that the third movie will be the most different from the book, and that is compounding the changes that they've already made from in the first two movies. And I think that's for the best, because I want the movies to be their own story, not just be slavish recreation.
Yeah, and not having read the book yet, that part of the book, my feeling at this moment is that yes, it would have looked silly, as I imagine it looked really silly in the '80s movie. But other people can tell me more about that. But I'm glad they didn't go that route, and I thought it was just superbly well done in this. Yeah. Do you want to hit anything else on the Harkonnens before we move on?
Well, I would perhaps what I would say is like a bridge from the Harkonnens to the Emperor and his daughter, because we must talk about the lovely Florence Pugh and her character of Princess Irulan, and Christopher Walken, Emperor Christopher Walken. Perhaps a bridging connection would be Charlotte Rampling's character of the mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, because she kind of is the one who bridges the Harkonnen Carino divide, because she is the power in the shadows who is kind of been serving as the go-between between the two, but she has her own agenda as well, and she sees them all as pawns. And one of the big things that's so fascinating about it is that all these, in classic palace intrigue fashion, all these different factions are playing against one another, where with like the Bene Gesserit led by Mother Mohiam are just like, we will find the levers of power to control both the Atreides and the Emperor and the Harkonnens, and then we will keep our grand designs in place. And then the Harkonnens are very much along the lines of, yeah, like we'll do their bidding for a time, but as soon as we get the chance, we're just going to kill everyone and take power for ourselves. And one of the fun undercurrents of that idea is that the Bene Gesserit, despite having the powers of foresight, are so convinced that they can control the situation. But the fact that Paul survives and is like risen up in this way, he effectively rips control of this prophecy away from them in a way that is both satisfying and horrifying.
Is it okay that, like, while I'm aware of the fact that, okay, I shouldn't cheer on where Paul goes at the end of this movie, because that is expressly not the point. Absolutely. And yet there is still satisfaction with where she's like, young Atreides, think about what you're doing, and he just with the voice goes silence, and she doubles back. Like, that is so like fist pumpingly, like, because you deserve that.
Oh, she does. She's not a nice she's not a nice lady. She has been the kind of the spider mistress in the shadows, pulling all the webs and her strings to try to bring everyone into their grand design. And she finally pulled one or two strands too hard, and her entire web kind of collapses on her, which is a satisfying like comeuppance for her character.
Yeah. So absolutely wonderful. So and that's what's so great about stories like this. Is like in that moment I can feel like, uh yeah, you earned that, and like cheer Paul on in that moment, but then simultaneously be like, nothing that Paul is doing here is cheer worthy. He's like gone full, you know, uh, yeah, full despotic, you know, ruler that we should be very afraid of, and yeah, it's those conflicting emotions that you feel in stories like this that make them so brilliant. But going talking about uh, you know the emperor, especially, like I was just so overjoyed that Christopher Walken was cast in this part. Um, because like someone who grew up with his movies, like I think the first thing I saw in theaters with him was, of course, as I'm sure it was for many people my generation, Batman Returns. um, and then I had seen some other stuff of his on TV. I'm sure this is not a common occurrence, but I actually think that the first thing I ever saw him in was a TV movie based on the story Sarah Plain and Tall, which he played a very normal guy versus some of his more eccentric characters.
Yeah.
But what's great about that is with this movie, he's not like doing his Christopher Walkenisms.
No, he's not.
It's a very dramatic, straight performance that's like chilling and cold, a lot of the time. And um, but he conveys both, like just even over the opening scene where Florence Pugh is narrating the opening, which I thought was a brilliant decision as a way to open the movie. Um, you know, when she talked about, I know my father loved Dude Leto, you can see that on his face, as well as like, you know, him doing what he believes, he needed to do, which is, very dark, but you can see those, the guy who can look Paul in the face and say your father was a weak man, and and that's why I killed him. Like the fact that you have a character saying that so coldly and then simultaneously still make you believe that he also loved
Yeah.
this man that he had killed. It's just, I thought it was a magnificent performance. Just made me wish we got more of it, but that's just not the role. It's meant to, his appearances are meant to be fleeting in the film, and just sort of hit at the right moments in the story.
Yeah, it's like it's a classic case of like when you cast an actor of Christopher Walken's caliber and stature, like you naturally think, oh, he's going to have like this big role in the movie, and Florence Pugh as well. But it's kind of a different case. In Christopher Walken's case, they cast an actor like this precisely because the character on is like has so few scenes that you really need a tremendous actor like Christopher Walken to give him the necessary impact in those scenes. And he does with like his sheer intensity and like inner conflict that he portrays, but also his ruthlessness. Let us not forget, like there's that scene where he brings the Baron to account and like shames him for his failures and has them cut his like airline in his presence, and you're like, oh yeah, like this is how this guy became emperor of the known universe, because he was willing to do ruthless things like this, even if it breaks his heart in the case of Leto. And his relationship with Florence Pugh, his daughter, Princess Irulan, is fascinating because, we see that she is a Bene Gesserit acolyte and has been trained by the Reverend Mother Mohaim herself. And she is incredibly capable, and it seems very much like the Emperor Shaddam is like viewing her as his heir. even if perhaps, she will need to marry to, continue the bloodline, he is very much of the idea like, that's why you'll be a great empress one day. He seeks her counsel, he seeks her insight. And we see that she has become very much like entrenched in the inner circle and is very much aware of all the politics between these different fashions and is thinking about them constantly. And she doesn't resent her role. She's been trained by the Bene Gesserit. She knows she'll need to marry. She's willing to marry for advantage, not for love, which is puts her in direct contrast with Chani. And it's an awesome performance by Florence Pugh. And in her case, it's a case of they cast an actress, a young up-and-coming actress of Florence Pugh's caliber because they need it for this movie. But also, it's not much of a spoiler. She plays a big, big role in the third movie if they're going to make that movie. So,
which I can't wait for. And that's the thing. She had a lot of great material in this film, but I was also thinking this feels like she's going to be a major character in the third part. Which and there's and to be honest, there's also some other actors who get introduced in this movie who from what I've read are not a presence in the third book, but those are instances where I hope that Denis, changes things up. Like Léa Seydoux' character, from what I understand, is not in the third book, but I hope she's in the movie. I hope they find a way to utilize her because she feels like an introduction to be a bigger player.
Oh yeah.
Later on.
Yeah, and Princess Irulan is in Dune Messiah quite extensively, so that will not be a change, although her characterization and the role she'll play may be. Lady Jessica, for instance, is not in that book. I have a feeling that's going to change, and Denis going to bring Rebecca Ferguson back. But it's a testament to him being able to collect these great collections of actors and get them to sign on for a project like this. Because as Eric points out in the chat, of Florence Pugh quietly becoming one of Hollywood's most dependable young actors. Yes, she is very much taking over the world, the MCU and all other forums everywhere. But I would say, and when you look at the young cast of this movie, if you were to make a list of most up-and-coming star power young actors under the age of 35, that list would include Timothy Chalamet, Zendaya, Austin Butler, Florence Pugh, and Anya Taylor-Joy. And this movie has all of them.
As impressive as this cast looks now, can you imagine years down the line looking back at this movie and it's gonna be like, oh my god, these movies had all these amazing people in it. It's just off the charts. And let me say that both Florence Pugh and Timothy Chalamet are so embody their characters that it was not until somebody pointed it out to me that I was like, oh shit, this is a reunion for them because they were in Little Women together.
Oh yes, yeah. Once again, Florence Pugh plays the woman who is Timothy Chalamet's second choice in love. Although in this case, it's a slightly different context.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I didn't even draw that connection. I was like, oh shit, yeah. Which, by the way, if you guys haven't seen the newest adaptation of Little Women, watch it and then go check out the stream I did on.
It's Greta Gerwig's best movie. No shade to Lady Bird or Barbie. Her with women is awesome.
Yeah, that one, I'm sort of, I'm not I'm certainly I enjoyed Barbie. I'm not against it getting, whatever awards attention does, but for my book, Little Women was the one that was the really egregious omission of a Best Director nomination for Greta Gerwig. because she absolutely was robbed of that, because she did such an amazing job on that, and that is one of those things that I will continue to be annoyed by.
Yeah, and but Florence Pugh did get her due for that movie, because famously, she played the character of Amy, who in previous adaptations of Little Women had not gotten quite the same shine, and Florence Pugh took that role and elevated it into an Oscar-nominated performance, which, with the help of Greta Gerwig's writing, of course. So it's like, and she is continuing to make interesting choices as an actress. Yeah, I'll sign up for that whenever that watch party, whenever we get the chance. But it's because this character of Princess Irulan, this is another character where, like, yes, she plays a bigger role in the third book, but in the original Dune book, like, the princess kind of just shows up at the end and agrees to marry Paul. They give her much more to do in this movie. She becomes much more of an active power player. She's the one who realizes, hey, this Muad'Dib that we're hearing about, who's causing all kinds of problems on the Arrakis, that's probably Paul Atreides, is it not? It is. And she's the one who, like, is going through all of the, like, these Bene Gesserit manipulations, and she's kind of like, oh, your plan is to, use Fayed Routha? This dude's psychotic. What are you doing?
Like, she has the normal reaction. Yeah. Like, she's like, he's psychotic.
Yeah. But she also has, like, a sympathetic angle to her, in the sense that, like, she does love her father and is devoted to her father. And, like, when we reach the end where Paul has cut down Fayed Routha and is now confronting the Emperor, and is basically like, I brought you to this planet. I have the spice under my control. As he says, he who can destroy a thing has the real control of it. Your famous Sardaukar army, I have destroyed them all. You've volunteered your champion. I killed him. Now you will bow. You will bow at my feet, or you will die. And you can see Shaddam is kind of like waffling, because if he defines himself by his power, what is he without it? And that's when Princess Irulan steps in and is basically like, stop this. I will be your willing bride, but spare my father's life. And that is the deal that Paul is willing to take. But of course, we also know that Princess Irulan is not without agency here. By agreeing to marry Paul, she becomes Empress of the known galaxy. And as a Bene Gesserit Alkalite, she has the power to wield and create the change that she may want to see. And that will be a big part of Dune Messiah going forward. And I also just love those shots that we get of Princess Irulan and Chani, like, opposed to one another, with Paul in the middle. Like, that's just beautiful framing, because these two women have never met. They don't exchange a word, but they are the two sides of the coin for Paul. They are the two paths he could take. And ultimately, even though he loves Chani and goes up to her before he does this and tells her, I want you to know I will love you as long as I breathe, which he had mentioned earlier in the movie, he ultimately chooses, no, I will marry Princess Irulan, and I will become Emperor of the Galaxy. And this is another element where where the changes come into play, because in the book, effectively, like, Chani, becomes she effectively becomes Paul's concubine, but everyone who is around them knows that she's his real wife. But clearly the movie is going in a different direction, because they open a schism between the two. And what's it going to be like with that interplay between Paul and Princess Irulan, with Chani is not in the picture for at least part of what comes next.
Yeah, it feels like that's a pretty big, that's something that'll have to be addressed with the third part of the story, because that's a pretty big shift. I don't know. I'm pretty open to. I may feel differently after I read the books, and then I'll be like, but no, I want to keep this closer to the book. But for now, I'm like, whatever Denis wants to do. Like he's, he's proven like he loves these stories. He's not gonna do wrong by, you know, by Frank Herbert, and it's he's just done such a remarkable job that I'm open to whatever direction he wants to take it. As for what that change means for the end of this film adaptation, it's so incredibly strong because it's just this, as we've been talking about, it's just this horrible betrayal and this stark division, you know, and then leads to you know, to her walking out of there. And it's just the strongest image. And I love that the film ends on her,
Yeah.
As someone who's, going to stay on, her home world. And, it's just, I thought it was brilliant. So actually it'll be interesting to see how I feel about the book, when I read that. I have a feeling usually the attitude I've always adopted is like that alterations like that actually just enhance one another so that you can get like both versions and appreciate them each for their differences. But I think that it was a very strong choice to make for telling the story in the modern age.
Yeah, and that's the truth about adaptations is they need to change with the times and they need to change based on the medium. Like the characters of Arulin and Chani in the book that was written back in the 50s, like that, those are not the characters that are going to be like compelling cinematic players in a 2024 film adaptation of this story. They can still be the same characters at their core, but you need to give them more to do, honestly. And this movie does that in incredibly compelling fashion, especially in the service of the two wonderful actresses that they have playing roles.
Okay, and a side note, can I just say that, like, and all the costume design, in these movies has been great, but Princess Arulin's, outfits are just out of this world amazing.
Yeah, no,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, if you put this this image up on the screen, and I don't know what's coming later in the year, but my immediate instinct is to say the Oscar for Best Costume Design next year is over because you just have to put
I am worried because they had to push the release date, so it is a long time between now and Oscar season, but I'm really hoping that that this stays fresh in voters' minds because this film at the very least should be sweeping the texts again. It's just out of this world. I wanted to win costume design, cinematography, production design, original score, like at the very least. It's an early, obviously I get more and more frustrated with trying to rank things, but like there just has to be something really strong coming out later in the year for this to not be like my number one film of 2024, but we'll see.
We'll see. It's March.
Yeah.
I'm going to give it time, but it is, it's an early.
But that almost feels like the reason why, like I hate even saying that because something that I've really come to feel over the years is, this whole idea of like, and that's why when I watch the Oscars tomorrow, it's just going to be about having fun, hanging out with friends, and like cheering on some movies that I love. But when it comes to like actually ranking movies throughout the year, I feel like that is so counterproductive to what it is to enjoy cinema. This film is great because it's great, not because it's going to be my number one movie of the year or something. It feels so reductive to rank things in that way. And so like, yeah, I tend not to like trying to do that too much anymore. But when we're in award season, the temptation is there to to do that. But
yeah, and it bears noting that this movie was originally supposed to be released last November, which meant it would have been competing for these Oscars that are going to be happening tomorrow. But the reason that they pushed it was so that because they were worried about the SAG-AFTRA strike and the ability of the actors to promote it. And it's clear from the response that this movie has gotten from the way that they had a big promotional tour, and it made $82 million last weekend, and is on its way to being a roaring financial success that will guarantee that we get the third movie almost certainly. They made the right choice to push it. It just is frustrating in that it had to happen that way, but given the circumstances, it was the right call. And I'm glad that this movie is now getting its own time for everyone to appreciate it, kind of separate from the furor surrounding award season, and hopefully it will be remembered when the time comes to vote for next year.
Yeah. In any case, if the third movie lives up to what they've done with these two films, I imagine there will be a really big awards push for that movie. So. So they'll have their shot there if nothing else. Just like I just casually put up the image of the three sandworms. Like we haven't even talked about like visual effects of this movie. Like I think Denis is like one of the best people in the industry for like being a director who knows how to handle visual effects. And then like because his movies always have such a strong foundation of filming in real locations, and and grounding everything in realism, and it's just like I felt that way, obviously about Blade Runner 2049, where everything just felt so tactile and real, and that film rightfully won Oscars for both visual effects and its cinematography, and the scale of this film with its visual effects is just out of this world. I very purposely took all my screen caps today from the IMAX trailers. I was lucky enough to see it in a digital IMAX cinema, and it just like the scale of this movie is out of this world. It's I'm a bit grumpy about the fact that the first film, when it was released on Blu-ray, it wasn't released in its IMAX version, and I'm sure probably be the same way with this. So if for those of you who either haven't seen it yet or have only seen it in the regular theater, go catch an IMAX if you can, but before it leaves. And it doesn't even have to, like, if you don't have one of the few like quote unquote real IMAX theaters, like film IMAX theaters around you, that's fine. Go to your nearest digital IMAX theater, and you won't regret the experience, because it was just it was out of this world.
Yeah. It is a visual masterpiece. It is a technical masterpiece, and it's the kind of thing that I'm so glad that, going back to our conversation at the beginning, where Denis Villeneuve believed in this vision, and he managed to convince Legendary Pictures, who financed most of the film, to give him the money for something like this that was most assuredly not a sure thing. And then he didn't waste a dime of it. The money's all on screen, and it looks fantastic. So I'm this is the kind of like epic, sweeping sci-fi film that really kind of helps to show others like what is possible with the format. And while there are other movies that have done that, especially Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, all the Dark Knight trilogy, like this is another step in that legacy of people being able to take movies like this seriously as cinematic art, and I'm just so happy that it is being recognized as such.
Yeah, when I was watching this, it was like, um, and this sounds reductive to Lord of the Rings, which anybody who knows me knows I am not being, because the visual splendor of those films is still like off the charts, amazing. Um, over 20 years after the fact, and those movies like still look absolutely brilliant. Uh, but I can also say like that the Lord of the Rings walked so that Dune could run, because when you see what they're able to accomplish now, um, with a movie of this scale and this size, like, uh, it's everything that I dreamed that 20 years on from the Lord of the Rings would be possible. And this is the same level of audacity with the visual scope of those films that I love and to see when I go to the cinema, and to still make it all feel so real. It is just incredible. Um, so
Yeah, well said.
um, okay, I did have a couple more like categories of things to talk about, but we have kind of like covered them as we've been, uh, having different like conversations, um, but we'll just sort of go through and cover some of the things that like didn't get along. I loved seeing Josh Brolin return as
Yeah.
Gurney. He's just so much fun, and not having read the book, I thought he died in the first film, but then of course once they started doing promotion for the film, I was like, oh hey, he's back. So I guess I guess he survived. And yeah, no, I just love like when he and Paul are reunited, and uh, you know he calls him old man again.
Yeah.
He goes, you young pup. It's just that's such a wonderful relationship that the two of them have, and then when he tells Paul about uh you know the stash of nuclear warheads that he knows the location of, and they're like, how much is there, and he's like, enough to destroy the planet, and he's like, you know what I mean. It's just like
Yeah,
those darkly comic lines.
yeah, Josh Brolin as Gurney is one of kind of this movie is not the most hilarious movie in the world, but there are a few moments of wry comedy, and Gurney provides a lot of them because he is kind of like an outsider's perspective on the whole situation, where he, is like a member of the surviving Atreides house, who then comes to be reunited with Paul as Paul has taken on his new life as a Fedaykin fighter with the Fremen. But what's interesting, and he's kind of like, well, that's weird, but okay. But he serves an important thematic role because his character is Paul's most direct connection to his old life, because from the moment that Gurney shows up, having lived a life as a smuggler, and is like strumming away on his banjo and is like, Lord, save me from these idiots, which is legitimately funny. But when he's reunited with Paul, his sense of purpose reunites, and he is the one who kind of starts pushing Paul, hey, you have this immense power, and we can use it to get revenge on the people who hurt and betrayed us. And there's that line that was in the trailer where Paul is talking about, the Fremen possibly seeing him as their messiah, and Gurney has the line that's funny but also dark. Where he's like, "Messiah, why is that a bad thing? Use it." And then Paul, and he's effectively telling him, take the power of these people and use it to destroy our enemies and serve our ends to get revenge for us. And Paul has that vision where he's like, I could lose control of this or all my visions lead to horror. And Gurney asks him why, and he's like, because you lose control. And Paul says, no, because I gain it. But Gurney is very directly motivated. He doesn't care about the wider geopolitics or galactic politics of the situation. He wants revenge on the people who killed his duke, who killed his house, who destroyed his wife and the life of the family he served. And he has that scene where when he's confronted about that, he basically is like, he spits it out. He's like, they killed my duke and my family and I want revenge. And he gets it, because he ends up where he manages to he's the one who kind of pulls Paul back into his old life and then helps him become once again Duke Paul Atreides of Arrakis.
Yeah, and this again is like, speaking earlier, it's like my one quibble with the film that I wish, and it's not even a quibble with this film. If anything, maybe there was a deleted scene in part one, as we've talked about, that maybe I could have used. Like he's lost family to the Harkonnens twice over, because he's lost his own actual family to them, and to Rabban, specifically, who he says, Rabban Harkonnen, murdered my family and gave me this star to remember him by. And so there's that experience. And then on top of that, they robbed him of his family once again when they slaughtered, the Atreides. And so, yeah, he just he's on board for anything so long as it grants him revenge. And yeah, it's a lovable character who is very haunted by personal demons, and I think one of the most, and he's another fascinating part of the adaptation for me, because even having only read the bits that I have, it's obvious to me that they actually did a bit of character amalgamation with him. He seems to be a blend of Gurney Halleck, but also of Thorfinn Hawat, who is in the first film, but is in a different capacity to what he is in the book. Simply by virtue of the fact that I think they put a lot of that into film version Gurney. And so, so I don't know what book readers' feelings about that are. I think it works really well because I love Josh Brolin's performance as the character. But yeah, my read on Gurney from what I'm reading so far in the book is that he's a bit more fun-loving.
Yeah, and I mean, and they hint at that with his musical talents. He's a singer who likes to compose ballads, but we don't have as much time for that in the film adaptation. And with any kind of epic sweeping story like this, there's always going to be some amalgamation, as you say, a condensation of characters. As you noted, Thufir Hawat, played by Stanley McKinley Henderson, was in the first movie. He actually was supposed to be in this movie as well. He kind of goes on to serve against his will the Harkonnens and undermine them from within. They ended up cutting him out of the movie, and that was the interview where Denis said it broke his heart to do that, but he did it for a reason. So Thufir Hawat does not really appear in this movie, and that's just kind of an adaptive choice that they made. But I do feel like the character of Gurney kind of serves a purpose, as we said, as Paul's tie to his old life. because they were friends, in addition to Gurney kind of being one of his mentors, along with Duncan Idaho, who he lost. Although, if you know anything about the upcoming books, you will know that Duncan Idaho's not done.
I've heard some things about that, and I'm like, okay.
Oh, you do.
We'll see how this.
Okay, John. I'm not going to spoil. I'm not going to spoil anything for you. I will just say that when I was, thinking about Dune Messiah and how they might adapt it, I went on a wiki dive, on the Dune wiki dive, refreshing my memory about the events of the later books. And oh my sweet God, there is some weird stuff in there. And a significant part of it centers around the many lives of Duncan Idaho. So if they do keep this franchise going, Jason Momoa will never be out of work for the rest of time.
This has been made clear to me, and it'll be interesting. I still haven't actually decided like how far I'm gonna go with reading the books, because I know I've heard that it gets it all gets very out there. So
yeah. It becomes much more an ecological and political fable involving a human sandworm hybrid and many weirder things. So,
yeah, we'll see how that goes.
I don't think Denis getting that far. I think he made it very clear where he wants to stop, and it's before that.
Oh wow. Okay. I'm trying to think if there were any big things that we didn't cover. But we are about to cross 3 hours, so it's, if we start wrapping up, that would be a good thing. Because God help us if we had this to rewatch and study beat by beat. God only knows how long this might have gone for, but that's an idea. I don't know how David Lynch would feel about that.
I might go for David Cronenberg for but yes, David Lynch will be much.
Which side notes, speaking of David Cronenberg, like one of my great pleasures over the past year has been watching Star Trek Discovery and finding out that David Cronenberg plays a character in that show. And out of the things that I would have expected, that wasn't one of them. Sorry for veering off topic, but I know you've mentioned about wanting to watch Discovery at some point, and so that's one of the things that you have to look forward to. I guess I'll just sort of wrap this up by saying, like, I hope very much that the third movie happens sooner rather than later, but Denis is free to do whatever he wants. And if he wants, this 2-film adaptation of the first book to just sit for a couple of years, then I think he's earned that. I'm like really looking forward to, seeing these characters continue on for another film. And one thing that I have gathered from what I've read is that there's a big time gap between the end of this story and where Dune Messiah picks up, which took me by surprise a little bit, because the end of the film almost feels like it could be gearing up to like tell a story that's a direct continuation, but actually it makes me even happier about the ending of this movie, knowing that the next time we pick up the story, it'll be, a good 12 years later, or maybe who knows how long Denis free to change that up to. But we'll see. I'm just so interested to see where these characters go, and I loved a lot of the character introductions we got in this film. I can't wait to see what we get from Florence Pugh, in the next movie. I think it's going to be great to see her take a more central role, and I like my one little hope, even though she's not in the third book, um, making time for the thirst part of the stream right now and just saying that Léa Seydoux should absolutely be in the next one, um, even though she's not in the book, because for reasons. Uh, and also I'm sure we talked about this, if Jessica's not in the book, I have no doubt she'll be in the movie. It'll be great to see how that continues on, and it's interesting because I know Denis talks about the fact that Frank Herbert actually wrote Dune Messiah in response to the fact that a lot of people misconstrued his meaning with Dune and perceived Paul as a hero, and that is blatantly not the case in this film version of things. It's very clear that he's an anti-hero at best, um, and so it'll be interesting to see how that affects the storytelling of the third and final part. Um, and I don't know, you addressed this a little bit talking about, because you're more familiar with with Dune Messiah than I am, that maybe there will be more changes to that part of the story than with this. I'm open to it because I haven't read the book yet, but even so, I think he's proven his ability as a storyteller in this world, and so I hope he does whatever he needs to do to make a compelling third part to the story that he's crafted on screen.
Yeah, and I think he will, and I have that trust in him. And when I think that there may be more changes there, that comes from a couple different fronts. One, from the necessary changes he's already made in these first two adaptations, and kind of just naturally following up on that. And that deals with, as I said, like kind of the character of Chani and her place in the story. Then there's the fact that Dune Messiah itself is a much less conventionally action-packed book than Dune is. So, it's much more about political intrigue, and they'll have to find ways to make that much more like cinematically relevant. I have every faith Denis will be able to do that, but that may involve altering the scale of the conflict somewhat. And then there's just pure speculation about like there are some interesting elements from the latter books, specifically related to the character of Aaliyah, that if they're not going to continue past Dune Messiah, I wonder if they might try to bring those forward. Specifically the whole idea of, as I mentioned, the idea of her being an abomination who has access to the memories of her ancestors. But that's speculation. What I will say for sure is that when I heard that Denis wanted to make this a trilogy, that appealed to me just because of my conventional, drilled in from Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. I'm like, trilogies are good. I like trilogies as a story structure. But when I thought about Dune Messiah being the conclusion to that trilogy, I'm like, okay, well, I can see why he's splitting this story up into two parts, because it's too big for one movie. That was another reason that David Lynch struggled with the Dune 80s movie, as he tried to condense it all into one. You really need to let this story breathe.
Yeah, I saw that the movie is like 2 hours and 20 minutes. I don't know how you condense this story into a film of that length.
By cutting a lot of stuff out. That's the answer. But specifically with Messiah, I'm like, Denis clearly has such a very specific thematic vision of the story he wanted to tell with these movies. And going back through Messiah, I'm like, that vision is very clear in that book. And in particular, without spoiling any specificities, the way that the character of concludes this chapter in the story of Paul Atreides when I read the end of like where his character would end Dune Messiah. I'm just like, that is an absolutely perfect ending for this cinematic iteration of the story. And I can just see the final image that he might be crafting for that. And I'm like, yeah, I get why that makes sense for him to end his story here, because the idea of like the dangers of religious messianic figures and the ascension of a man to like effective godhood and what happens. Messiah is effectively what happens when gods fall, when the messiahs fall. And the way that Paul ends his story, basically in the kind of the conflict between being a god and being a man, and how he chooses to resolve that. I'm like, for this cinematic iteration adaptation of the Dune story, that's perfect. I totally see why he wants to end his story
Yeah. I guess the only thing I didn't get to, which I kept saying, oh, we're going to talk about that, but we did sort of talk about it a bit throughout, was the character of Stilgard, who is just, like I said, I just view him as very tragic throughout this movie, even though he gets a lot of the best lines. But just to see, his fanatical devotion to Paul by the end of the film, and almost to comedic levels at some point, like when he wins the fight against Federatha, and and he goes, well, dude, it's like it just, it's really incredibly sad, because my first impression of this guy in the first Dune was, someone who was like a very stern leader of his people, and wanted to do right by his people. But he's been, but as we learn in this film, he comes from the very religious, sect of, of the Fremen people, and and it's just too firmly ingrained, and in his upbringing, and who he is as a person, and he gets completely consumed by it, and and yet we also, it's this weird thing where we both love his, like, his admiration and devotion for Paul, but we're also very saddened by it, because because he's been deceived, by just this religious indoctrination, and it's, yeah. So I just found that very sad, and I'm worried about where it leads him, in the third part, which I don't yet know about, because I haven't read the book, but I don't imagine it's anywhere good. But yeah.
Yeah, no, Javier Bardem honestly gives one of the best performances in this movie that is not short on great performances. And as you alluded to, in the first movie, he is much more kind of coded as like the noble leader of the Fremen people. And in this movie, we see a very different side of him, that kind of fundamentalist religious zealot that emerges tragically, and as you alluded to. And yes, like that image that you just had up on the screen, that's become kind of like a meme for people, just having fun with the movie, the whole like the San al Gaib. But it's a much deeper story, because as you said, it's very much, this was his culture, this was ingrained into him and his people before he was even born, and he just devoted he believed it in his core. And once he started to see the signs, as he says, it's almost like he was skeptical at first, but once he starts to believe, that belief just consumes him. And there's even a moment when Paul is expressing doubt, and he has that line where it bursts out of him. He's like, I don't care what you believe. I believe. That's such a strange thing to say to your Messiah figure, but in his case, it's very much, he's like, almost like, I need you to become the man that I believe you are so that we can fulfill this destiny together. And he's willing to give his life for it. But
it's actually a very,
he ends up becoming the most.
It's actually a very like common device when we see these messianic stories, but it's usually used as a plus, where it's like, you, the chosen one, you may not believe in yourself, and you may dismiss all this talk of, a chosen one, but I believe, and it's, and there's shades of that, and I think of the Matrix, and the fact that Neo may not believe in himself, but Morpheus believes. And even in the third film, I think it's the second film, when somebody says to Morpheus, "Damn it, Morpheus! Not everyone believes what you believe," and he says, "My beliefs do not require them to." And there's that kind of thing of, my belief is strong enough for for others, and yeah, in the first one, like, and throughout the entire trilogy, really, his belief in Morpheus is found, Aryan Neo is found to be like a right thing, and something that, even though it's shown that the prophecy in that movie is something that's been manufactured.
Yeah.
By the end of the story, Neo still proves himself to be the one, and it's a good thing in that story. In this, though, this is the deconstruction of that, of the white savior trope, and and all that, and so even though it's, in a way, we kind of look at him, and it's almost admirable to have that kind of, that hope in the face of hopelessness, that belief, even though people tell you shouldn't believe, but in a story where we know that's all been manufactured, and so it's a very sad thing to look at him, the fact that this very strong man is pouring all of this belief into something that's been, built up with the intention of, of causing all this religious fervor in him and his people, when you'd much rather he put all that into being, the leader of his people, that, that he's proven himself that he can be, and that he should be, and that's the strength that should drive their people, that it should come from within themselves, and the fact, though, that he's so consumed by, his belief in, in the Lisan Al Gaib, and, to fanatical levels, and so it's just really, it's really sad, but yet we love him.
Yeah, no, and it's because Javier Bardem gives such an incredibly commanding and charismatic performance in the service of that very disturbing, character arc, and he makes you see and feel the tragedy. And I just also, because we're going to be wrapping up here, I did want to take the opportunity to shout out one other member of the cast who we have not mentioned yet, who, because she is probably by far the smallest name in terms of like general audience recognition, which is Sohila Yacob. She is the actress who portrays Chani's friend, Shishakli. And she's kind of the one who is like the, kind of serves as Chani's sounding board for throughout the movie as to what her feelings are about Paul. And she's very much in Chani's camp of like, we don't believe this guy is the Messiah, but she also grows to respect Paul. And then and it's a very like authentic and, performance by a young actress who is like kind of making her mark. And of course, it's also notable that she is the one who ends up getting sacrificed in horrific fashion when Feyd-Rautha starts his campaign to root out the Fremen from their sieges, and Shishakli is the one who is left behind and meets a horrific end by fire at Feyd-Rautha's hands. So, and that's kind of a catalyzation for Paul's radicalization, because that's the moment he realizes he needs to go south to stop these kinds of wars from happening. And of course, that ends up lighting the flame that he won't be able to contain.
Yeah. Yeah, it just shows that there was so much to talk about this that we didn't have the opportunity to talk about, because it's one of those smaller roles that, like, in the face of such a large ensemble cast, you could almost, as we have done on this stream, kind of, overlook, but she does a great job throughout the movie of just like representing the the Fremen people who are not Shawnee, who are, growing to admire Paul. And I love the ribbing that she gives him, when, he's going for his first, sandworm ride. And she's like, don't embarrass, embarrass us, get a big one.
Yeah.
And then, of course, yeah, I absolutely love Stilgar's, like, not that. Yeah, it's so amazing. And it's funny, we didn't even talk about the that scene, which is one of, like, the key scenes of the movie. Just so absolutely, like, because how do you visualize someone riding a sandworm? This is like the kind of thing that we didn't have to think about as viewers, but must have been a nightmare for them to conceptualize, in the actual film. And of course, like, Hans Zimmer's score in this scene is just great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, by the way, I want to mention, like, one of the key things about, while I'm mentioning the music in this scene, is the because we get the female vocals in the scene when he actually rides the sandworm, which is like what I kind of think of as the Paul as the the chosen one, the his theme for when he is leaving Paul behind and is becoming Muad'Dib, and really embodying that the prophecy, and it's his theme with Shawnee that is really embodying his humanity. That and so, yeah, again, like, circling back to what we were talking about earlier, just beautiful work by Hans that makes scenes like this really come alive.
No, that is a scene of pure, like, movie magic. And it's the kind of thing that, yes, and the dismounting, that's also movie magic, where you get away with it by not showing it.
Okay, and this was, like, the one thing that I did call a little, and I say this lovingly, but I did call a little bit of bullshit on, which was, how the hell did they get this thing on the worm? That Jessica's riding it.
Only Shai Hulud knows.
But that's one of those things, like, where, yeah, it's like, how are they loading stuff onto the worms, and how are they getting off the worms? Like, that's all the movie magic, like you said, where it happens off screen, so they figure it out. Don't worry. But yeah, no, I interrupted you. Were you?
No, I was just gonna say that, like, that, we don't often sometimes talk as much about, like, the action scenes and the epic, like, moments like that, just because it's not, like, as, it's harder for us to just, talk about, like, oh my God, it's so cool, as opposed to delving into the thematic richness of the character conflict, but that scene's so fucking cool. it's the kind of thing where you're like, yeah, like contrast this with like 1984 with what they had to do with the sandworms and a 2024 budget.
I've seen pictures of Paul riding the sandworm from the 80s movie, and I'm like, yeah, this was better.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's not that movie's fault, you know, it made do with the time.
Yeah,
like, this is the kind of thing where you're like, oh, like this just looks awesome, and the picture that you should put up earlier, like where the Sardaukar have like laid out their army in front of the Emperor's pyramid, and they're like waiting for the Fremen army to arrive, and then they bring the storm with the atomics, and then the sandworms like come crashing out of the sand and just annihilate the Sardaukar. You're like, oh yeah, this is the good shit right here.
Yeah, and it almost, what's so interesting is that it almost, like, as astonishing as those sequences are, it almost feels besides the point, because like what Denis is clearly most interested in here is character and drama. And so, as breathtaking as those larger than life sequences are, they do almost feel like they play secondary to, you know, to the character drama. And so, and I think that's quite an achievement right there. Doesn't mean he skimps on the action stuff though, because those scenes are breathtaking.
No, he does not.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a good place to wrap up. We going on 3.5 hours. We only saw the movie once, but we still pulled it off. Yeah, no, and in some ways it just sort of enhanced the conversation, because I still don't have a clear like vision of, you know, of the film. It's almost like, it's like I said before, it's like it's still a fever dream. And in some ways
Spice dream.
Yeah, spice dream, and that's, you know, and that can be a very great way to have a conversation about it. So yeah. You got any final comments?
Yeah, all I'll just say is with a movie like this, I've alluded to the fact, like, when we talk about like scientific epics or sci-fi epics or fantasy epics that we love, like Lord of the Rings, like Star Wars, and like the Batman movies, and like Game of Thrones, and then like Dune, there can be a tendency to pit them against each other, and we've deliberately avoided doing that because they were all inspired by one another, but they were also all like learned from one another, and they all stand on their own as beautiful and unique stories. Personally, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars will always be closest to my heart, but that doesn't mean there's not room in my heart for something like Dune, because I got to be honest, I did not like. I've read the books. Or at least the first couple in the series. It was not something that I grew up loving quite as much as some of the like the Lord of the Rings, say, or Star Wars. But these movies have just opened up that possibility anew, and I just was, and in the hands of one of my favorite working filmmakers, and Denis Villeneuve, it is magic. You know, this is movie magic. He brought the world of Arrakis to life in fantastic fashion, and I just hope that even if it's not going to be like the same defining event or whatever for me, because have like loved so many of these movies and franchises, I love this one too, and I hope that for a young kid who goes out to see these movies today, that they will be as every bit as awe-inspiring and life-changing as the Star Wars films and the Lord of the Rings films were for me, because that's what it's all about. Telling the next great story and loving, you know, and loving these stories in a way that they can, enhance your life in and keep your heart and mind open. So these movies did that for me, and until they are a resounding success, and I very much hope that Messiah will continue that journey when we get the third movie to complete the trilogy in the future.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing when we talk about these genre stories that are, sort of defining and, where they sit and sort of the pantheon of their respective genres. And, and Star Wars was something that was with me from when I was a kid. Like, even though I wasn't a really diehard fan until the special editions came out, like, I still knew about Star Wars before that. And so it was always sort of part of my subconscious. And so that's a very unique experience that nothing can replicate. It's something that's with you from childhood. And then with Lord of the Rings, which came to me during my adolescence, which is another very important part. It's where you're discovering things about yourself. And that story very much taught me a lot about, who I was and my love for storytelling in both literature and cinema. Like the books taught me to love reading, and the films taught me that not only did I love movies, but that I loved filmmaking. And I said in the Force Center, uh, Discord, maybe not the best place to say this, given that it was a Star Wars group. But I said that my position on Lord of the Rings was that, and no hyperbole intended, it's the greatest story ever told, and I stand by that. That for me, the books are untouchable, the films are untouchable. Again, probably maybe shouldn't have said that in the Star Wars group. But it's like, but Star Wars is as close to my heart, just in a different way. But for me, Lord of the Rings is always going to be something that means the world to me, and nothing is ever going to come close to that personally. But now I'm an adult, and it's very interesting to have an experience with something I compare it to Lord of the Rings in terms of its, the scope of its storytelling and what these films will mean for the genre of science fiction, when we look back 20 years from now. But it could never be the same as something else was for me in my youth. That's just not the way things work. But I love the fact that it's coming to me at a very specific time in my life now, where I'm now a grown adult, and it's a story that is dealing with themes that are very adult in a different way from what I experienced with Lord of the Rings, with Star Wars. I felt this way about Game of Thrones too. Like, that's something that I could only have come to as an adult. And so it means something very different to me. And so what I'm building up to here as a closing statement is that it doesn't mean that it's like, it wasn't the same experience as, like, I wouldn't say like it's as great as Lord of the Rings, because that's a very specific experience that was more formative to me than anything else ever could be. But I'll be damned if it's not as close to an experience like that as I can have now as an adult.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking for different things now, and I'm a different person. And what these films presented me with was just so inspiring and thrilling. And the fact that I sat there feeling like I was, you know, it's such a special feeling when, you know, when you're taking something in and you're like, I need to remember what this feels like, because it's the same feeling that I had when I was watching the Battle of Helm's Deep, 20 some odd years ago. And, and just that recognition that it's a very important moment in my journey as a lover of cinema. And I could not be more overjoyed that I'm having an experience like that in the year 2024 as I get ready to turn 40 years old, when I'm in a different phase of my life, and that cinema can still thrill me like that. And I'll end right there.
Well said. Keep your heart open, and those experiences will hopefully continue to come for many, many years.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody who joined us tonight, and hopefully we'll get some people coming back to watch later once they've seen the movie. I really hope Erin will sit down and watch the stream, because I know she saw the movie tonight. I hope she enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Danny.
Thank you, Dan.
It's not lost on us that we went for 3.5 hours and you guys, stuck with us. So thank you very much. And next week we'll be talking Sense and Sensibility, which I can't wait, to dive into that. Just some of my absolute, favorite people are in that movie. It's, got Emma Thompson, Kate Winslet, Hugh Grant, the great Alan Rickman, may he rest in peace. I can't wait to see that performance again. He's so great. And then the week after that, we'll be talking about Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which, is another favorite that I'm so happy that we're going to talk about that, because that's just not something that, a lot of people love it, but it's not one of those things where I feel like I'd be able to, easily grab somebody to do a stream about it with. So I'm very happy we're going to do that. And once again, we'll be back to Sundays from now on for the foreseeable future. We don't plan on, we definitely don't plan on, moving off of Sunday again for a while, unless something comes up, but we'll announce it in advance. Sense and Sensibility has so many great actors. One of my great joys was after I had already seen the film many, many times, coming to watch it like 10 years ago or something like that, and discovering that Hugh Laurie is in it. And it's a small part, but he is absolutely hysterical. Looking forward to that. That's going to be a wonderful change of pace next week. Once again, if for those of you who are in the Slack group, if you want to join us tomorrow night at 7:00, we're going to be watching the Oscars. So it'd be great for you guys to join us in for that. And and if you're not in the Slack and you'd like to join us, just find me on Twitter. Our links are in the description, and just shoot me a message and I'll get you an invite. All right. Anything you want to mention, Jerry?
Nope. Just excited for Sense and Sensibility and Batman Mask of the Phantasm. Excited for the Oscars. Go Oppenheimer. And thank you for this conversation, John. It was a joy to be able to talk about a movie like this. So I will just close my own final word with saying with all love, may thy knife chip and shatter.
Oh my God, so good. And I could launch into more conversation with that, but let's just end with that. Uh, have a wonderful night, everybody.
Take care.
And I'll just echo that with may thy knife chip and shatter. Bye.